Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that stretches between the stars, and in that silence, something waits. Something ancient, something patient, something that once ruled every corner of this galaxy with an authority so absolute that even the stars themselves bent to its will. The Necrons. Say the name slowly, let it sit on your tongue, and feel the weight of 60 million years of darkness pressing behind those syllables. 60 million years of dreamless sleep, of cold metal resting beneath worlds that would be born, flourish, and die without ever knowing what slumbered in the vaults below their feet. When most people talk about the Necrons, they talk about power, and rightly so. These are beings whose technology borders on what lesser civilizations would call divine. Their Gauss weapons strip matter apart atom by atom, peeling away the very substance of reality like pulling threads from old cloth. Their living metal bodies repair themselves from wounds that would leave any other warrior a cooling corpse on the ground. Their cryptechs bend time, fold space, manipulate matter at levels that make the greatest achievements of the Adeptus Mechanicus look like a child stacking wooden blocks. Their warships can cross the breadth of the galaxy in the time it takes an Imperial Navy vessel to chart a single jump through the warp. They have devices that can extinguish stars. They have weapons that can erase entire civilizations from the record of history as if they had never existed at all. Consider for a moment the Celestial Orrery, a device housed deep within the Oroscar dynasty's crown world of Thanatos. Yet it is a map of the galaxy rendered in holographic light and arcane technology. Every star represented by a tiny flickering mote of light suspended in the vast darkness of the chamber. But it is more than a map. Each of those tiny lights is connected to the actual star it represents, linked across impossible distances by technology that predates the evolution of every currently living species in the galaxy. If a Necron cryptech were to reach out and extinguish one of those lights, the corresponding star would die. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The actual star, burning millions of light years away, would simply go out, as if someone had blown out a candle. The Celestial Orrery can kill stars, and it is just one device, one artifact among thousands, in a single dynasty's collection. The World Engine was a mobile battle station of such staggering power that it took the combined might of multiple Space Marine chapters and an entire sector fleet to bring it down. And even then, victory required a suicidal ramming action by a battle barge at full speed. The Breath of the Gods was a device capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of reality on a stellar scale. The Dolmen Gates allow the Necrons to breach the webway itself, the extra-dimensional highway that the Elder built over millions of years, giving the Necrons access to a transportation network they have no right to possess. And these are merely the weapons and tools that have been documented by Imperial scholars. There are others, sealed in the deepest vaults of tomb worlds that have not yet awakened, whose capabilities can only be guessed at through the fragmentary records that survive from the age of the Necron Empire. So what, you might ask, could beings of such terrifying capability possibly fear? It is a fair question. On the surface, the Necrons appear to be the most secure, most formidable, most utterly unassailable faction in the entire galaxy. They have weapons that can unmake stars and rewrite the laws of physics. They have bodies that repair themselves from almost any damage. They have numbers that, even diminished by 60 million years of attrition, still dwarf most other intelligent species in the galaxy. They have been fighting wars since before the earliest ancestors of humanity had crawled out of the primordial oceans of old Earth, and they have won most of them. Or what could possibly frighten a civilization that has defeated gods? The answer, it turns out, is a great deal. And that is what we are going to explore today. Because the fears of the Necrons are not the simple, instinctive dreads of lesser creatures. They are not afraid of the dark, or of pain, or of the enemy waiting on the other side of a hill. Their fears are deep, structural, woven into the very fabric of what they are and what they have become. They are fears born from choices made so long ago that the light from the stars that witnessed those choices has long since gone cold. They are fears that echo across the empty corridors of tomb worlds, like the last reverberations of a scream that never quite fades away. Because here is the truth that so many overlook when they study the Necrons from the outside. Behind the implacable advance of Silver Legions, behind the cold green glow of Gauss weaponry, behind the flawless tactical calculations of overlords and pharaohs, there is something profoundly broken, something wounded, something afraid. The Necrons are not the unstoppable juggernaut they appear to be. They are a species in crisis, a civilization teetering on the edge of several different kinds of extinction simultaneously, and the most terrifying part of their existence is not what they can do to others, but what has already been done to them. So settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you like, and let me take you on a journey through the deepest fears of the galaxy's most ancient empire. We are going to walk through tomb-lit corridors where the air tastes of ozone and forgotten centuries. And we are going to listen to the whispers of overlords who have seen civilizations rise and fall like seasons passing in a garden they can no longer tend. We are going to peer into the abyss that the Necrons face every single time they open their optical sensors and confront the cold, unyielding reality of what they have become. This is the story of what the Necrons are actually afraid of. And trust me when I tell you, it is far more unsettling than anything they have ever done on the battlefield. Before we descend into those fears, though, I want you to hold one more image in your mind. Think about what the galaxy sees when it looks at the Necrons. Think about an Imperial guardsman, some poor kid from a hive world who signed up because the alternative was starving in the underhive, standing on a battlefield when the ground begins to crack and heave and the first silver forms begin to claw their way up from beneath the earth. What does he see? He sees warriors made of living metal, their eyes burning with a cold green light that seems to come from somewhere far away and long ago. He sees Gauss weapons that strip the flesh from bone in an instant, unraveling a human body at the molecular level so that one moment there is a man standing there, a man with a name and a family and a favorite meal and a memory of his mother's voice. And the next moment, there is nothing, just a faint shimmer in the air where a person used to be. He sees Necron warriors march forward with the relentless pace of machines that do not tire, do not falter, do not hesitate. He watches them fall to bolter fire and lasgun shots, or watches their bodies hit the ground with the heavy clang of metal on stone. And then he watches them get back up. The living metal flows like mercury, sealing bullet holes, reknitting severed limbs, restoring function to systems that should have been destroyed beyond all possibility of repair. He empties magazine after magazine into the advancing line, and the line keeps coming, and the warriors he has already killed stand up again and again and again, until his ammunition runs dry and his courage breaks, and the last thing he ever sees is the emotionless gaze of a being that was old when the stars that light his homeworld were still forming from clouds of cosmic dust. That is what the galaxy fears when it thinks about the Necrons. And it is a reasonable fear. It is a fear grounded in observable reality. Yes, in the very real and very terrible things that the Necrons can and do inflict upon the living. But it is also, in a sense, backwards. Because the things that terrify the galaxy about the Necrons are, for the Necrons themselves, not sources of pride or confidence, but reminders of everything they have lost. The living metal body that regenerates from any wound is a prison. The Gauss weapon that disintegrates organic matter is a tool wielded by hands that can never again feel the texture of what they destroy. The tireless march of the Necron warrior is not discipline or courage, but the absence of everything that makes discipline and courage meaningful. The absence of fear, the absence of hope, the absence of the choice to be brave in the face of danger. The Necrons are not frightening because they are powerful. They are frightening because they are empty. And the most terrifying thing about an empty vessel is not what it can do to you, but the question of what it must feel like to be one. Let us begin, not with the Necrons as they are now, but with the Necrons as they once were. Because to understand what they fear, you first have to understand what they lost. And to understand what they lost, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to a time before the Silver Legions and the Emerald Glow, back to a time when they were not machines at all, but something far more fragile, far more desperate, and far more afraid. They were the Necrontyr, and the Necrontyr were dying. Not slowly, not gently, not in the quiet way that old things sometimes fade from the world. They were dying violently, constantly, relentlessly, yet consumed from the inside out by the very star that should have given them life. Their homeworld orbited a sun so fierce, so irradiated, so mercilessly hostile to organic life, that every Necrontyr who drew breath did so under a sentence of death that had already been pronounced. The cancers came early, and they came often. The radiation storms stripped the atmosphere and hammered the surface with energies that tore through flesh and bone like invisible blades. The average Necrontyr lifespan was brutally short, a fraction of what the other great civilizations of that ancient era enjoyed. They watched as the old ones, those serene and ancient masters of the galaxy, lived for what seemed like forever, strolling through the ages with the casual immortality of creatures who had never known what it felt like to watch their own bodies betray them. And imagine that. Imagine building a civilization, a culture, an entire way of understanding the universe, all while knowing that every single member of your species is racing against a clock that runs far too fast. Imagine looking up at the stars and knowing that the light reaching your eyes has traveled farther in a single journey than you will ever travel in your entire life. Imagine the fury, the jealousy, the desperate, clawing need to find some way, any way, to escape the biological prison that your own sun has locked you inside. This is where the first fear was born. Not the fear of an enemy or a weapon or a strategy gone wrong, but the fear of mortality itself. The fear that your species, for all its brilliance, for all its ambition, for all its towering monuments and intricate technologies, is ultimately nothing more than a brief flicker of consciousness in an indifferent universe. The Necrontyr feared death the way a drowning man fears the water, not as an abstract concept, not as a philosophical curiosity, but as an ever-present, suffocating reality that colored every single moment of their existence. Their cities reflected this fear. Where other civilizations built towers reaching toward the sky, monuments to aspiration and hope, the Necrontyr built tombs, vast, elaborate, achingly beautiful tombs that dwarfed the homes of the living. Because for the Necrontyr, the dead outnumbered the living by such a staggering margin that it made more practical sense to invest in the architecture of death than in the architecture of life. The living were transients, our brief visitors passing through a world that ultimately belonged to those who had already departed. Their art was defined by it. Necrontyr poetry, what fragments have been preserved in the archives of the dynasties, is a literature of loss and longing, of beauty observed through the knowledge that the observer would soon be unable to observe anything at all. Their music was haunting and minor-keyed, compositions that spoke of endings rather than beginnings, of twilight rather than dawn. Even their humor, what little evidence exists that the Necrontyr had any capacity for levity, was dark and mordant. The gallows laughter of a species that had made its peace with the gallows and was simply waiting for the drop. Their science was driven by a single obsession, the conquest of death. Every breakthrough in Necrontyr physics, chemistry, biology, as an engineering was evaluated through the lens of whether it brought them closer to immortality. They developed medical technologies that were extraordinary by any standard, extending their pitifully short lifespans by decades, sometimes even centuries, through interventions that other species would have considered miraculous. But every extension was temporary. Every treatment eventually failed. The cancers came back, the radiation damage accumulated, and the body surrendered to the star that had been killing it since the moment of conception. The Necrontyre could delay death, they could never defeat it. And the knowledge that their best efforts would always, ultimately fail was a wound that never healed and never stopped hurting. Their religion was shaped by it too. The Necrontyre worshipped gods of death and transformation, deities whose domains encompassed the crossing from life to whatever lay beyond. Their temples were tombs, their priests were morticians, their holiest rituals were funerals. They did not celebrate birth the way other species did. A new Necrontyre life was not an occasion for joy, but for a kind of solemn compassion, an acknowledgement that another consciousness had been condemned to the same brief, painful existence that all Necrontyre endured. Welcome to the world, the traditional greeting might be paraphrased. We are sorry for what it will do to you. Everything about Necrontyre culture was shaped by this fundamental terror. Their politics were consumed by it. Their science was driven by it. Their wars were ignited by it. But when they looked at the Old Ones and saw beings who had somehow conquered the very force that was consuming the Necrontyre from within, the response was not admiration or curiosity, but something much darker. It was rage. Pure, nuclear, civilization-defining rage, directed at creatures who had what the Necrontyre wanted more than anything else in the universe, and who, for reasons the Necrontyre could never accept, refused to share it. The Old Ones would not teach them the secret of immortality. Whether this was wisdom or cruelty, whether the Old Ones had legitimate reasons for withholding this knowledge, or whether they were simply indifferent to the suffering of a lesser species, the result was the same. The Necrontyre were left to die, generation after generation, while the Old Ones continued their serene existence among the stars. And so the Necrontyre went to war. Not because they thought they could win necessarily, but because the alternative, accepting their mortality and their place in the cosmic order, was simply unthinkable. The war in heaven, as it would come to be known, was one of the most destructive conflicts in galactic history, a war fought across millions of years and billions of worlds, a war that would reshape the very fabric of reality itself. The Necrontyre were outmatched from the start. The Old Ones were the dominant species in the galaxy, a civilization of such staggering age and power that they had literally shaped the development of the cosmos around them. They were the masters of the webway, the architects of the galaxy's psychic landscape, as the gardeners of 1,000 evolving species that they cultivated and guided toward purposes of their own choosing. Their understanding of the universe was so comprehensive, their technology so advanced, their mastery of the warp so complete, that the Necrontyre's efforts to challenge them were, initially, almost pitiable. The Necrontyre had impressive technology, yes, but they were fighting against beings who had been refining their craft for hundreds of millions of years. It was the difference between a talented amateur and a grandmaster who had been playing the game since before the amateur's species had learned to walk upright. The initial phase of the war in heaven went poorly for the Necrontyre. Their fleets were outmaneuvered, their armies outfought, their strategies anticipated and countered by opponents who could literally see the future and manipulate the fabric of space-time to their advantage. The Old Ones retreated into the webway when pressed, using the extra-dimensional network as a staging ground from which they could strike at any point in the galaxy, and then vanish before the Necrontyre could respond. The Necrontyre could not follow them into the webway. They did not have the psychic ability to create their own pathways, and the Old Ones' wards and barriers kept them out as effectively as castle walls keep out a besieging army. It was this desperation, this string of defeats and humiliations at the hands of an enemy that seemed to be playing the game of war on an entirely different level, that made the Necrontyre vulnerable to the Citan's offer. A dying species, or losing a war it could not afford to lose, was presented with a chance to become something more powerful than it had ever dreamed of being. The price was high, impossibly high, but by the time the offer was made, the Necrontyre were no longer in a position to negotiate from strength. They were drowning, and the Citan were the only hand reaching down from above the water. Think about the scale of that conflict for a moment. Millions of years, not decades, not centuries. Millions of years of continuous, galaxy-spanning warfare. Stars were weaponized, used as ammunition in bombardments of incomprehensible scale. Entire star systems were consumed by artificial black holes, or erased from existence by weapons that manipulated the fundamental constants of physics. Or worlds that had taken billions of years to form were reduced to asteroid belts in the span of hours. The webway, that magnificent extra-dimensional network that the old ones had woven through the fabric of space-time over geological epochs, became a battlefield where armies clashed in corridors that existed between dimensions, fighting for control of junctions and pathways that connected distant corners of the galaxy. And the Necrontyr lost. Badly, decisively. The old ones, with their mastery of the warp and their command of the webway, proved to be far more than the Necrontyr could handle. The old ones could move their forces anywhere in the galaxy almost instantaneously, appearing behind Necrontyr lines, striking at supply depots and command centers, and vanishing before a response could be organized. They wielded psychic powers that the Necrontyr had no way to counter, powers that could tear ships apart from the inside, corrupt targeting systems, and shatter the morale of entire armies with a single, focused thought. The great Necrontyr empire was pushed back, broken, scattered, reduced from a galaxy-spanning civilization to a bitter remnant clinging to the irradiated shores of their dying homeworld. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necrontyr, desperately searched for some unifying force to hold their fractured civilization together. Civil wars, known as the Wars of Secession, had erupted among the Necrontyr even as the war against the Old Ones raged, as rival dynasties competed for dwindling resources and political power. The Necrontyr were tearing themselves apart even as their external enemies drove them toward extinction. Or something had to change. Something had to give them hope, or at the very least, a common enemy to unite against. This should have been the end. By any reasonable measure of history, the Necrontyr should have faded away, becoming just another extinct species in the long catalogue of civilizations that had burned too bright and too briefly against the cold backdrop of the cosmos. But the fear of death is a powerful thing. It can make a species do things that no rational mind would contemplate, accept bargains that no sane soul would agree to, reach out to powers that no wisdom would dare invoke. And that is exactly what the Necrontyr did. When the Citan came to them, when those ancient star-born entities descended from the heavens wrapped in bodies of living metal that the Necrontyr themselves had forged, yet the offer they brought was precisely what the Necrontyr had been praying for, since the first radiation storm had claimed the first Necrontyr life. The Citan were beings of almost incomprehensible power, energy entities that had existed since the first moments of the universe, feeding on the electromagnetic radiation of stars. They had no physical forms of their own until the Necrontyr crafted bodies of necrodermis for them, giving them shape and substance, and the ability to interact with the material world in ways they never had before. And in return for this gift, the Citan offered immortality, an end to the cancers and the decay and the slow, agonizing march toward oblivion that had defined Necrontyr existence since its earliest days. There is a detail about this offer that is worth dwelling on, because it speaks to the depth of the Necrontyr's desperation and the cunning of the C'tan's approach. The Citan did not present themselves as strangers offering a deal. They came wearing the forms of the Necrontyr's own ancient gods, their half-forgotten deities given flesh and presence through bodies of living metal. They claimed to have fought the Old Ones before the Necrontyr even existed, positioning themselves as allies against a shared enemy, rather than opportunistic predators seeking to exploit a dying civilization. The deceiver, the Citan known as Mephetran, was the one who made first contact, and his name tells you everything you need to know about the honesty of the offer. The Silent King, Zarek, the last and greatest of the Necrontyre rulers, heard the offer. The Triarch debated it for an entire year, while weighing the potential benefits against the risks, considering the implications, listening to arguments for and against. Orican the Diviner, the court astrologer, was the only voice raised in clear opposition. He saw something in the future that troubled him, some portent or probability that suggested the Satan's offer was not what it appeared to be. But his warnings were dismissed, drowned out by the overwhelming weight of desperation that pressed upon the entire Necrontyre civilization. And despite the warnings of his court astrologer, despite whatever misgivings he may have privately harbored, Zarek accepted. The Satan, led by the creature known as Mephetran the Deceiver, had spun their promises with all the skill of beings who had manipulated reality since the first stars ignited. They failed to mention certain details. They neglected to explain what precisely the process of biotransference would actually entail. They did not tell the Silent King that when his people marched into the biofurnaces, they would not simply be exchanging flesh for metal, that the price would be something far more fundamental, far more irreplaceable, far more precious than mere physical form. They would lose their souls. And this brings us to the second, and perhaps the deepest, of the Necron fears. The fear of what they became. Picture the scene. Imagine it as vividly as you can, because unless you can feel the weight of what happened in those biofurnaces, you will never truly understand why the Necrons are afraid. Vast, cyclopean structures, built to a scale that beggared comprehension, roaring with energies that made the air itself scream. Into these furnaces, as the Necrontyre marched, millions upon millions of them, an entire species, walking willingly into what they believed was salvation. What they had been promised was their deliverance from the curse of mortality. What came out the other side was not what went in. The flesh was gone. That much was expected. In its place was necrodermis, the living metal that the Satan themselves were housed in, a substance so advanced that it could repair itself, reshape itself, endure impacts and temperatures and forces that would vaporize any organic material. The new bodies were magnificent, stronger, faster, more durable than anything the Necrontyre had ever built. Immortal as promised, undying as guaranteed, perfect instruments of war, perfect vessels for an eternal existence. But something else was gone too. Something that the Satan had failed to mention. Something that became horrifyingly apparent only after the process was complete, and there was no way to reverse it. The Necrontyre had souls. They had rich, complex inner lives filled with emotion and sensation, and the ineffable quality of consciousness that makes a living being more than just a collection of processes and reactions. They could feel joy, sorrow, love, anger, hope, despair. They could dream. They could imagine. They could look at a sunset and feel something stir inside them that had nothing to do with optical input and everything to do with the deep, mysterious wellspring of meaning that consciousness creates when it encounters beauty. All of that was gone. The Satan had fed on it. As the Necrontyre passed through the biofurnaces, the star gods had swooped and dove above the raging energies, glutting themselves on the spiritual essence of an entire species. Every soul, every consciousness, every spark of what had made the Necrontyre who they were was consumed by entities whose hunger knew no bounds and no mercy. What emerged from the furnaces were not Necrontyre in metal bodies. They were something else entirely. Echoes, shadows, pale, flickering imitations of the beings who had walked in, powered by the guttering remnants of minds that had been stripped of everything that made them truly alive. The Silent King was among the first to realize what had happened. He emerged from his own biotransference and looked upon his new form with eyes that were no longer eyes, but optical sensors, and he felt it immediately, an emptiness, and a hollowness so profound that it defied rational explanation. His new body was superior in every measurable way to the frail, cancer-ridden flesh he had left behind. His thoughts were faster, clearer, more precise than they had ever been. He could perceive the universe with a fidelity and range that his organic senses had never approached. And yet there was something missing, something fundamental, something that all the technology in the universe could not replicate or replace. He had lost his soul, and with it, he had lost everything that made existence worth having. The worst part was the scope of what he had done. This was not a personal tragedy, not a single life ruined by a bad decision. This was genocide on a spiritual level, the erasure of an entire species' inner life in one catastrophic act of desperate bargaining. Every Necron tire, from the highest noble to the lowest laborer, from the warrior to the poet to the child, had been fed into the furnaces and had come out the other side as something less than what they were. The lowest ranks had it worst. The common Necron tire, those without the wealth or status to afford more sophisticated neural architecture, emerged from biotransference as little more than automatons. Dull-witted, personality stripped, barely conscious, they were living weapons that could march and fight and follow orders, but could no longer think, feel, or remember who they had once been. Even children, Necron tire children, were transferred into fully adult mechanical bodies, with their young minds wiped clean of everything that had made them individuals. Let that sink in for a moment. Children, their laughter, their curiosity, their boundless capacity for wonder and discovery, all of it consumed by hungry gods and replaced with nothing but the cold hum of machinery and the vacant stare of optical sensors that would never again see the world through the lens of innocence. The scale of this spiritual genocide is difficult to comprehend. Try to imagine it in human terms. Imagine if every human being on Earth, all 8 billion of them, were to walk into a machine and come out the other side as metal automatons. The poets would no longer write poetry. The musicians would no longer compose. The lovers would no longer love. The parents would look at their children and feel nothing because the capacity for feeling had been stripped from them, along with their flesh. 8 billion interior lives, 8 billion unique perspectives on the universe, 8 billion irreplaceable experiences of consciousness, all snuffed out in a single act of industrial transformation. Now multiply that by the population of an entire galactic civilization that spanned thousands of worlds, and you begin to approach the scale of what happened during biotransference. The Necrontier did not merely lose their bodies, they lost their civilization's entire capacity for art, for beauty, for love, for meaning. Everything that makes a civilization worth preserving was consumed by the Satan in the same fires that forged the Necrons' immortal bodies. The nobility fared better, if you can call it that. The overlords and lords and cryptechs retained more of their original personalities, more of their memories and drives and individual quirks. But even they were diminished, as even the strongest-willed among them emerged from the process as shadows of what they had been, stripped of the emotional depth and spiritual richness that had once defined their inner lives. They could remember what it had felt like to be alive, but they could not feel it anymore. They were left with the cruel gift of knowing what they had lost, without any ability to recover it. This is the fear that lives at the heart of every self-aware Necron. Not the fear of an external threat, not the fear of an enemy army or a rival dynasty or a dangerous alien species. It is the fear of their own condition. The fear that they are not truly alive, that the thing that makes existence meaningful, the thing that separates a conscious being from a very sophisticated machine, was taken from them and can never be returned. It is the fear of being hollow, of existing without truly living, of persisting through the ages as nothing more than an echo of someone who died 60 million years ago in a furnace that promised salvation and delivered damnation. And the Silent King carried this fear alone for longer than any being should have to endure it. After the war in heaven was won, after the old ones were finally broken and their civilization scattered, Zarek bided his time. He did not act rashly. He waited, watching the Citan grow fat and complacent on the life energies of the galaxy, letting them believe that the Necrons were loyal servants, content with their lot. And then, when the moment was right, when the Sultan were at their most vulnerable, distracted by their own infighting and gorged on the feast of a conquered galaxy, the Silent King struck. What the Necron revolt against the Sultan is one of the most audacious acts in galactic history. These were gods they were fighting, beings whose power was derived from the fundamental forces of the universe, entities that could reshape reality with a thought and consume stars as casually as a mortal might eat a meal. The Necrons turned the very weapons they had used to defeat the Old Ones against their former masters, focusing unimaginable energies into killing strokes that even the star gods could not withstand. The war against the Sultan was not a single battle, but a campaign of cosmic proportions. The Necrons had to fight beings whose power dwarfed their own, entities that could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality, that could consume energy on a stellar scale, that could reshape matter with a thought. The Nightbringer, Azagorod, was perhaps the most physically dangerous of the star gods, a being so associated with death that it had literally implanted the concept into the psyche of every mortal species in the galaxy. When the Nightbringer walked the battlefield, the very idea of mortality walked with it, a primal terror that predated civilization itself. The Necrons had to bring this entity down, had to shatter something that was, for all practical purposes, the incarnation of death itself, and they did it knowing that the broken remnants would need to be contained forever, because even a fragment of the Nightbringer retained enough power to level cities and unmake armies. The deceiver, Mephetran, was perhaps the most difficult to pin down. True to its nature, it had anticipated the betrayal, or at least some variation of it, and had prepared contingencies. Some accounts suggest that the deceiver allowed itself to be shattered, that the fragments the Necrons imprisoned were not the full totality of the star god, but merely the portions it chose to sacrifice, decoys left behind while the true intelligence escaped into the cracks and shadows of reality. Whether this is true, or merely another of the deceiver's endless lies, is a question that even the most learned cryptex cannot answer with certainty, and the uncertainty itself is a source of fear. The Void Dragon, Magladroth, was the Satan most closely associated with technology and the manipulation of matter. It was the Void Dragon whose knowledge had made biotransference possible, whose understanding of the material universe had given the Necrons the tools to construct their bodies of living metal and their weapons of atomic dissolution. Shattering the Void Dragon was, in a sense, an act of supreme ingratitude.
Quick, I just want to step out the lore for a second and give you my personal take on all of this, because honestly, this is one of the reasons the Necrons became my favorite faction to talk about. When I first got into 40k, I thought they were just the boring skeleton robots, like, cool design, sure, but where's the depth, right? And then I actually started reading into their lore, especially around biotransference and what they lost, and it completely flipped my perspective. The idea that you could win, you could get exactly what you asked for, mortality, power, everything, and it still ruins you because the cost was something you didn't even realize you were paying. That hits different. That is not just good sci-fi writing, that is genuinely one of the best tragedies in all of fiction if you ask me. And I think that is why so many people are drawn to the Necrons now compared to 10 or 15 years ago. Games Workshop finally gave them a soul, which is ironic considering the whole point is that they lost theirs. But anyways, let's get back to the lore.
Turning the fruits of the star god's own genius against it. But the Necrons had no room for gratitude, only for the cold calculation that the Satan had to be stopped before their hunger consumed everything that remained. Most of the Satan were shattered, broken into fragments, each shard retaining a fraction of the original god's power and consciousness. These shards were imprisoned in extra-dimensional containers called tesseract labyrinths, where they would serve as weapons for the Necrons to deploy in times of dire need. It was a reversal of cosmic proportions. The slaves had overthrown their masters, the worshippers had caged their gods, and the beings who had been promised salvation had taken their revenge on the creatures who had delivered damnation instead. But the victory was hollow. The Satan were imprisoned, yes, but the damage they had done could not be undone. The souls were still gone. The consciousness was still diminished. The vast majority of the Necron species was still reduced to mindless automata, following the commands of their betters. And the galaxy, ravaged by millions of years of warfare, was no longer a place where the Necrons could simply assert their dominance and begin rebuilding. The Eldar, those psychically potent beings created by the Old Ones as weapons against the Necrons, had survived the war and were now the dominant force in the galaxy. The Necrons, exhausted and diminished, could not hope to overcome them in their current state. So Sarek made another decision, one that would define the Necron species for the next 60 million years. He ordered the Great Sleep. On every Necron, from the mightiest Pharaon to the lowest warrior, was to enter their stasis crypts and sleep, dormant and dreaming of nothing, for 60 million years. Long enough for the Eldar to rise and fall, as all flesh eventually does. Long enough for the galaxy to heal. Long enough, Sarek hoped, for the Necrons to awaken to a universe where they could finally, perhaps, begin to undo the terrible bargain of biotransference. Before he sealed the last of the stasis crypts, Sarek did something extraordinary. He destroyed the command protocols that gave him direct control over every Necron in existence. These protocols had been embedded during biotransference, giving the Silent King absolute authority over his subjects, the power to command their loyalty, their obedience, their very thoughts. By destroying them, Sarek freed his people from his own tyranny, giving them the chance to wake as individuals rather than slaves. It was an act of penitence, an acknowledgement that his decision to accept biotransference had been a catastrophic mistake, and that the least he could do was ensure that his people would not be imprisoned by his will as well as by their metal bodies. Then the Silent King left. He departed the galaxy entirely, journeying into the intergalactic void in a vessel so massive it was practically a world unto itself, the Song of Oblivion. With him went legions of his own Zarakan dynasty, sealed in stasis crypts for the long journey. He left behind his people, his guilt, and his responsibility, seeking whatever penance or purpose the void might offer a being who had condemned his entire species to an eternity of soulless existence. But the intergalactic void is a place of absolute emptiness, a darkness so complete that the word dark fails to capture it. Between the galaxies, there are no stars, no planets, no cosmic landmarks of any kind. There is only the void, stretching in every direction to distances that the human mind cannot meaningfully conceptualize. This is where Sarek spent 60 million years, drifting through the most profound isolation imaginable, accompanied only by his own guilt and whatever thoughts a being without a soul is capable of having in the absence of external stimulation. What did the Silent King think about during those endless eons of solitude? What conclusions did he reach? What plans did he formulate? What insights did the vast emptiness of the intergalactic void grant to a mind that had already been contemplating its mistakes for longer than most species exist? These are questions that only Sarek can answer, and he has shown no inclination to do so. What is known is that when he finally turned his vessel back toward the Milky Way, he did so with a clarity of purpose that suggested his time in exile had not been wasted. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew what needed to be done, and he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to achieve it. The return of the Silent King is one of the most significant events in recent galactic history, though few species outside the Necrons are even aware it has occurred. Sarek emerged from the void with a fleet that dwarfed anything the galaxy had seen in millennia. His personal dynasty arrayed around him in formations that spoke of a military mind that had not dulled during its long absence. He began immediately to awaken dormant tomb worlds, to consolidate Necron forces, and to implement strategies that had clearly been in development for millions of years. His return transformed the Necron species from a collection of squabbling dynasties into something approaching a unified civilization, held together not by command protocols or hierarchical obedience, but by the sheer force of Sarek's personality and the undeniable urgency of his message. The galaxy was dying. The Tyranids were coming. And if the Necrons did not act, everything they had suffered, everything they had endured, everything they had sacrificed across 60 million years of darkness and guilt and mechanical half-life would be for nothing. For 60 million years the Necrons slept, and the galaxy changed around them in ways that no one, not even the Silent King with all his foresight, could have anticipated. Some Necrons cope with the fear of their condition through denial. They throw themselves into the business of dynasty building and conquest, into the elaborate political games and territorial disputes that occupy the attention of the Necron nobility, because activity provides a distraction from the abyss that yawns inside their mechanical cores. Others cope through obsession, latching onto some particular pursuit or collection or goal with a manic intensity that serves as a substitute for the genuine passion they can no longer feel. Trazyn the Infinite, with his compulsive need to collect and preserve specimens of every interesting thing in the galaxy, is perhaps the most famous example of this coping mechanism, a being who fills the void inside himself with objects, endlessly acquiring and cataloguing and preserving, because the alternative is to sit still and confront the emptiness. Illuminor Serus offers another variation on this theme. Serus is a cryptech whose obsession with the mechanics of biotransference has consumed his entire existence since the moment he first awakened from the Great Sleep. He experiments endlessly on captured organic beings, dissecting them with a precision that borders on artistry, studying the relationship between biological tissue and consciousness, with a dedication that would be admirable if it were not so deeply unsettling. Serus believes that the key to reversing biotransference lies in understanding exactly how consciousness interacts with organic matter, and he pursues this understanding with a single-mindedness that has made him one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. Entire populations have been abducted for his experiments. Whole species have been subjected to his investigations. The screams of his subjects, according to those who have had the misfortune of being within earshot of his laboratories, can be heard through the walls of his fortress for hours at a time. What makes Serus particularly chilling is the fact that his work may actually be productive. Unlike the idle obsessions of other Necron nobles, which serve primarily as distractions from the existential horror of their condition, Serus's research addresses the core problem of the Necron species directly. He's trying to understand how to put a mind back into a body. He's trying to decode the relationship between consciousness and flesh. And if he succeeds, if his endless experiments eventually yield the breakthrough that the Silent King has been pursuing for 60 million years, the resulting technology could change the fate of the entire Necron species. But the price of that success, measured in the suffering of the countless organic beings who have been broken on Serus's operating tables, raises a question that the Necrons are ill-equipped to answer. At what point does the pursuit of salvation become so morally catastrophic that the salvation itself is no longer worth having? For beings who have lost the capacity for moral reasoning along with their souls, this question has no answer. They can calculate the cost in statistical terms, in lives lost and resources expended, but they cannot feel the weight of what those numbers represent. And that inability is itself another symptom of the condition they are trying to cure. And some Necrons do not cope at all. Some confront the reality of their condition and break under its weight, their minds fragmenting into madness as the full horror of biotransference crashes over them like a wave they cannot swim against. These are the ones who fall to the curses and the cults, the ones whose fear becomes so overwhelming that it transforms into something worse. Which brings us to the next fear, a fear that other Necrons can see approaching, can watch spreading through their ranks like a disease for which there is no cure and no immunity. It's a fear that strikes at the very foundation of what little stability their fractured civilization still possesses. The Flare virus. There is a story that the Necrons tell among themselves, though tell is perhaps the wrong word for beings who communicate through cold data bursts and encrypted transmissions. It is more of a memory, a piece of data encoded so deeply in the collective consciousness of the Necron species that even the lowest-ranking warrior carries some dim echo of its meaning. It is the story of Yandugor, the Flayer, and the curse he laid upon his killers in the final moments of his existence. Of all the Catan, Landugor was perhaps the most visceral, the most primal, the most intimately connected to the raw, screaming hunger that defined the Star God's relationship with organic life. While the Nightbringer dealt in death and the Deceiver traded in lies, the Flayer's domain was hunger itself, a hunger so vast and so consuming that it could never be satisfied, a hunger that gnawed at the edges of sanity and reason like acid eating through metal. When the Necrons finally turned against their Satan masters after the defeat of the Old Ones, when they focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into weapons powerful enough to shatter gods, most of the Satan were broken into fragments, reduced to shards of their former glory, and imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, where they could be contained and, when necessary, weaponized. But Landugor was different. Whether by design or by necessity, the Necrons did not merely shatter the Flayer. They destroyed him utterly, annihilating him so completely that not even a shard remained. The Maynarch dynasty is rumored to have been the instrument of this destruction, acting on the direct order of the Silent King himself. And it was the Maynarch who were the first to feel the consequences of their success. Because Landugor, in the final moments before oblivion claimed him, managed one last act of devastating spite. He cursed his killers. He cursed them with an echo of his own defining characteristic, his insatiable, maddening, never-ending hunger. The words attributed to Landugor in those final moments have been preserved in Necron records, and they carry a weight that transcends mere data. To those who have turned their faces away, he said, to those who are faithless and wretched in their jealousies, to those who have denied us, to those who have denied me, I will wreak vengeance. I will wrench your souls and break your bones. I will cast hunger through your accursed existence. Down the eons you will not forget. I will grant you this gift, from love turned aside, and make you like me. Break you in my image as you have broken me. I shall cast the fear of myself into you and all of your kind. Those words were not an idle threat. They were a prophecy that has been unfolding across 60 million years, and the Necrons have been powerless to stop it. To truly appreciate the horror of the Flayer virus, you need to understand how it manifests. It does not strike suddenly, like a bolt of lightning or a bullet between the eyes. It creeps. It whispers. It begins as a slight deviation in behavior and a momentary fixation on organic material that a healthy Necron would dismiss without a second thought. Perhaps a warrior lingers a fraction of a second longer than necessary over a fallen enemy, its optical sensors tracking the way blood pools and congeals on the ground. Perhaps an overlord finds its attention drawn to the texture of human skin during a tactical briefing, the way the light catches the fine hairs on a prisoner's forearm. These are tiny things, insignificant in isolation, easily dismissed as the kind of minor engrammatic fluctuation that any Necron might experience. But they are not insignificant. They are the first symptoms, the first cracks in the dam. As the virus progresses, the fixation grows. The infected Necron begins to seek out organic material, and gravitating toward battlefields and scenes of violence not for tactical reasons, but because the sight and proximity of flesh awakens something deep within its corroded programming. It starts to collect trophies, small at first, a finger here, a strip of skin there, items that could be explained away as battlefield souvenirs or intelligence samples. But the collection grows, and the justifications become thinner, and eventually the infected Necron stops bothering to justify its behavior at all. In the final stages, the transformation is complete. The Necron's hands extend into long, multi-jointed claws, designed with surgical precision for the removal of flesh from bone. Its personality, whatever remained of it after biotransference and 60 million years of stasis, is consumed entirely by the hunger. It becomes a flayed one, a creature that exists in a state of perpetual, frenzied need, a being that cannot think, cannot plan, cannot reason beyond the immediate compulsion to find living things and take their skin. The flayer virus, as it has come to be known, is a condition that defies easy explanation. It is not a disease in the conventional sense, not a pathogen that can be identified and eliminated through medical science. It is something closer to a spiritual contagion, a corruption that infects the engrammatic pathways of a Necron's consciousness and gradually, inexorably, replaces whatever personality remains with an overwhelming compulsion to kill, to tear, to rend organic flesh from bone and drape it across their metal bodies in grotesque parodies of the living forms they can never possess again. Necrons afflicted by the flayer virus undergo a transformation that is horrifying, even by the standards of a galaxy that has no shortage of horrors. They become flayed ones, creatures that exist in a state of perpetual, frenzied hunger for something they can never consume. Their hands extend into long, razor-sharp claws designed for one purpose: the efficient separation of flesh from bone. They seek out living beings with single-minded determination, killing them with brutal efficiency, and then adorning themselves with the bloody remnants of their victims. Skin, muscle, organs, all of it is draped across their skeletal metal forms in a ghastly display that serves no practical purpose but satisfies some deep, irrational compulsion that the afflicted Necron is powerless to resist. What's the truly disturbing thing about the flayed ones is the question of why they do this. They cannot eat. They have no mouths, no digestive systems, no biological processes that could make use of organic material. The flesh they collect simply hangs from their bodies, rotting and decaying until it falls away and is replaced by fresh trophies from the next kill. Some scholars of Necron behavior have theorized that the flayed ones are driven by a subconscious desire to return to organic form, that somewhere in the corrupted remnants of their programming, there exists a desperate longing for the flesh and blood existence that biotransference stole from them, and the virus expresses this longing in the most horrifying way imaginable, by compelling its victims to literally try to wear the bodies of the living, as other Necrons fear the flayed ones with an intensity that borders on panic. And this is significant because Necrons are not creatures that frighten easily. These are beings who have stood in the path of tyrannid biotitans, who have faced down demon princes and chaos warbands, who have weathered firepower that would vaporize a continent, all without flinching. And yet the sight of a flayed one is enough to make even the most decorated overlord recoil. The flayed ones occupy a unique and terrifying position in the Necron military hierarchy, or more accurately, outside it. They are outcasts, pariahs, beings so thoroughly corrupted by the flayer virus that they can no longer function within the structured society of a tomb world. They haunt the dimensional interstices, the spaces between reality where matter and energy blur together, us emerging without warning into the material world when the scent of blood draws them forth. Their phase-shifting technology, an eerie remnant of their former existence as functional Necron warriors, allows them to materialize from thin air, stepping out of nothingness with their claws already extended and their stolen skins flapping wetly around their skeletal frames. Imagine facing them in battle. You are an Imperial guardsman, deployed to some backwater world to put down what your commanders have described as a minor Xenos incursion. The night is dark, the air is still, and the only sound is the low hum of the generator powering your field camp's perimeter lights. Then the lights flicker. Just once, just briefly, but enough to make you glance up from your weapon. When you look back at the tree line, if something is standing there that was not there a moment ago, something tall, something impossibly thin, something draped in what appears to be strips of wet leather that you realize, with a lurch of your stomach, is human skin. It is looking at you. Its optical sensors glow with the same cold green light as any Necron warrior. But there is something different about the way it moves, something twitchy and desperate and hungry that sets it apart from the mechanical precision you have been trained to expect. Then there are more of them, dozens, hundreds. They materialize from the air itself, stepping out of the space between moments, their claws clicking against each other with a sound like scissors being sharpened. They do not speak. They do not issue challenges or demands. They simply advance, are drawn by the proximity of living flesh, like moths to a flame that will not warm them, but that they cannot resist approaching. The reason for this fear is simple and devastating. The Flayer virus is contagious. It spreads through contact with the living metal skin of infected Necrons, and in some accounts, it can spread through mere proximity, through the exchange of data, or even through the psychic resonance of shared thought. No Necron is immune. No rank is too high, no will too strong, no programming too sophisticated to resist the curse of Landugor forever. Every self-aware Necron knows, at some level, that the Flayer virus could come for them. That one day, they might wake from stasis to find their thoughts dissolving into a red fog of hunger, their hands elongating into killing instruments, at their identity and their purpose consumed by a compulsion older than most stars. For eons, the virus went unnoticed. It spread silently through the Necron population during the Great Sleep, traveling from tomb world to tomb world along the subtle connections that linked the sleeping legions. By the time the true nature of the condition became apparent, it had already infected thousands, perhaps millions of Necrons across dozens of dynasties. The Maynarch dynasty, the ones who had actually destroyed Landugor, were among the hardest hit. Many of their number retained a semblance of sanity despite the infection, their rage and hunger becoming a directed force rather than a mindless frenzy. But the taint ran deep through their entire civilization. The response of healthy Necron society to the flayed ones is telling. Or any Necron found to be infected is immediately exiled or destroyed. There is no treatment, no cure, no therapy that can reverse the progression of the virus. Cryptechs have spent millennia researching the condition, pouring their considerable scientific expertise into the problem, and they have found nothing. The curse of Yandugor is, so far as anyone can determine, permanent and irreversible. Once it takes hold, there is no going back. This means that every Necron who watches a comrade succumb to the Flayer virus is watching a preview of their own potential future. They are seeing what they might become, what they could become, if fortune or fate or the lingering malice of a dead god decides to reach out and touch them. The fear is not abstract, it is personal, immediate, and utterly rational. Yet the Flayer virus is a ticking bomb embedded in the very substance of Necron existence, and no one knows when or where it will detonate next. In the northeast corner of the galaxy, in a region of space known as the Ghoul Stars, there exists a place that even other Necrons speak of only in encrypted whispers. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak. It is an entire tomb world populated almost exclusively by flayed ones, a realm of endless, mindless violence ruled by a single figure known as Valgul the Fallen Lord. Valgul is said to be the only Necron who has ever succumbed to the Flayer virus and retained his sanity, though sanity may be too generous a word for whatever passes as reason in his corroded mind. The world itself is devoid of organic life, are stripped clean by generations of flayed ones who have consumed everything that could be consumed and now spend their existence fighting each other for scraps of rotting meat and fragments of bone. Every few cycles, when the food runs out entirely, Valgul rises from his throne of bone and declares a time of bounty. Fleets launch from Drazak, carrying hordes of flayed ones to nearby worlds where they fall upon the living with an appetite that nothing can satiate. They kill everything they find, drape themselves in the remains, and return to Drazak to begin the cycle again. Drazak is a nightmare, a vision of what could happen to any tomb world, any dynasty, any Necron civilization if the Flayer virus were allowed to spread unchecked. It is the Necron equivalent of a plague colony, a leper island floating in the void, and in its very existence serves as a constant reminder that the curse of Landugor is not merely a theoretical threat, but a living, active, ongoing catastrophe that has already claimed an entire kingdom and shows no signs of stopping. The fear of the Flayer virus is the fear of losing control. Not control over others, not the political or military control that overlords spend their existence competing for, but control over oneself. It is the fear of waking up one day and discovering that the person you were is gone, replaced by something that hungers and kills and drapes itself in the remnants of its victims because it can do nothing else. For beings who have already lost so much, who have already sacrificed their bodies, their souls, their mortality, and their humanity on the altar of survival, though the prospect of losing their minds as well is a terror almost too great to contemplate, and yet they must contemplate it. Because the Flayer virus is not the only form of madness that stalks the corridors of the tomb worlds. There is another, equally feared, equally contagious, and in some ways, even more insidious: the Destroyer cult. If the flayed ones represent the Necron fear of losing control to hunger and madness, the Destroyers represent something arguably worse: the fear of losing control to despair, the fear that the only rational response to the Necron's condition, to the soulless, purposeless, eternal half-life that biotransference has condemned them to, is to embrace annihilation, not just for themselves, but for everything. Yeah, the Destroyers are Necrons who have awakened from their long sleep and looked upon the universe with eyes unclouded by hope or denial. They have seen the truth of their existence, the truth that they are no longer alive in any meaningful sense, that they are trapped in bodies of metal for an eternity that stretches before them like an empty road leading nowhere. And they have made a choice. If existence is meaningless, if there is no redemption, no salvation, no possibility of reclaiming what was lost, then the only honest response is to ensure that nothing else gets to enjoy what the Necrons have been denied. If they cannot live, then nothing will live. If they cannot feel, then there will be nothing left to feel about. They will scour the galaxy clean of every organic cell, every living system, every spark of biological consciousness, until the universe is as empty and cold and purposeless as they are. This is not the hot rage of a warrior seeking vengeance. This is something colder, deeper, and far more disturbing. It is philosophical nihilism given physical form, a worldview so bleak and so absolute that it has become indistinguishable from madness. The Destroyers do not hate organic life the way a soldier hates the enemy. They do not fight with passion or fury or any of the emotions that normally drive beings to violence. They fight with the detached, methodical efficiency of a janitor cleaning a floor, removing stains one by one, working steadily and tirelessly toward a goal that most other beings would find incomprehensible. Even the lowliest Necron warrior longs for a return to the time of flesh, as for some way to reverse the terrible bargain of biotransference and reclaim the organic existence that was stolen from them. This longing is one of the few genuinely universal traits of the Necron species, a thread of shared desire that connects the mindless automata of the lower ranks to the sophisticated, self-aware nobility. Every Necron, at some fundamental level, wants to be alive again. The Destroyers have abandoned this desire. They have looked at it, weighed it, and found it wanting. They have concluded that the hope of reversing biotransference is a fantasy, a cruel joke played by an indifferent universe on beings too broken to accept the obvious truth. And in abandoning this hope, they have abandoned the last thing that connected them to their former selves, as the last remnant of the Necrontire spirit that survived 60 million years of mechanical existence. What remains is something that frightens even other Necrons, a consciousness stripped of every motivation except destruction, every purpose except negation, every drive except the cold, relentless compulsion to make the universe match the emptiness they feel inside. The Destroyers modify their own bodies with ruthless efficiency, replacing limbs and components with ever more powerful weapons. fusing their torsos to anti-gravity platforms for greater mobility, stripping away any decorative elements or markers of rank or identity, because none of it matters anymore. All that matters is the kill count. All that matters is the slow, patient work of making the galaxy a little emptier, a little quieter, as a little closer to the total silence that the destroyers have decided is the only appropriate soundtrack for the universe they inhabit. There is a quote attributed to the destroyer known as Tfektis that captures the philosophy of the cult with chilling precision. Life festers in such profusion that it may take me countless galactic ages to see it all eradicated, this being has stated. There are more efficient ways, but many necessitate the willing cooperation of other species, others who will slay as I do. I have not the time to inculcate any in the universe's great truth, the fundamental need for it to be cleansed of life. Such a solution would require the cooperating mortals to continue in their existence, even as they ended that of others. Unacceptable. The logic here is both flawless and insane. The destroyer cannot accept allies, because allies would have to remain alive, and the entire point of the exercise is the elimination of all life. It is a closed loop of nihilism, a philosophical position that admits no compromise and no conclusion, except the heat death of all biological reality. The destroyers do not merely kill on the battlefield. When they take a world, they scour it. They eliminate every form of organic life, from the largest fauna to the smallest bacterium. They boil the oceans to kill the microorganisms that live within them. They burn the forests to destroy the insects and the fungi and the tiny invisible creatures that inhabit the soil. Even if the process takes decades, they will not stop until every single organic cell on the planet has been destroyed. And when they are finished, when the world is as barren and lifeless as their own consciousness, they welcome their own destruction, because they themselves are among the living, in some distant technical sense, and the final act of their crusade must include the erasure of themselves. The variety of destroyers has only grown over the millennia. The Skorpek destroyers are close combat specialists, terrifying multi-limbed killing machines that sprint into the midst of enemy formations and turn living bodies into component parts with hyperphase blades that cut through armor and flesh with equal ease. The Ophidian destroyers burrow through the earth like metallic serpents, emerging beneath their targets in eruptions of soil and stone, before dragging their victims down into tunnels that collapse behind them. The Hexmark destroyers evolved from Deathmarks, precision assassins whose 6 arms each bear a pistol, allowing them to eliminate targets with a speed and accuracy that defies description. And the Locust destroyers, the oldest variant, hover above the battlefield on anti-gravity platforms, raining death from above, with Gauss weapons modified for maximum destructive output. Each variant is a different expression of the same core madness. Each one represents a different answer to the same terrible question. What is the most efficient way to ensure that nothing organic survives? Other Necrons treat destroyer cult members the way healthy communities treat plague carriers, with a mixture of pity, fear, and determined avoidance. Destroyer cults are found on virtually every tomb world, which means the madness is endemic, built into the very structure of Necron civilization, like a fault line running through bedrock. No dynasty is immune. No rank is safe. Even Necron overlords, the most powerful and sophisticated minds in the entire species, can succumb to the destroyer madness. And when they do, the result is a being of terrifying capability and absolute nihilistic purpose. A destroyer lord combines the tactical brilliance, the nigh invulnerability, and the advanced weaponry of a Necron noble with the absolute, unwavering commitment to annihilation that defines the destroyer cult. These beings are among the greatest threats to organic life in the galaxy, and the only reason the Imperium is not more aware of this danger is that destroyer lords are so devastatingly effective that they tend not to leave witnesses. The fear here is not merely that individual Necrons are falling to the destroyer madness. It is that the rate of infection appears to be accelerating. More Necrons are succumbing now than ever before, and the trend shows no signs of reversing. Whatever psychological or engrammatic factors predispose a Necron to the destroyer condition, they seem to be becoming more prevalent as more tomb worlds awaken and more Necrons confront the reality of their post-biotransference existence. The implication is deeply troubling. The destroyer cult may not be an aberration, a bug in the system that can be contained and managed. It may be the natural endpoint of the Necron condition, the inevitable destination toward which every Necron consciousness is slowly, inexorably traveling. Given enough time, given enough awakenings, given enough centuries of staring into the void of their own soulless existence, every Necron may eventually reach the same conclusion that the destroyers have already reached. Everything must die, including, eventually, themselves. Necrosaur Amentar stands as perhaps the most feared example of what the destroyer madness can produce. Believed to be the first and most powerful of all Necron destroyer lords, Amentar's very existence has been scrubbed from the collective Necron memory, a feat that only the Silent King himself possesses the command protocols to achieve. The fact that Zarek went to such lengths to erase all record of Amentar's origins speaks volumes about the threat this being represents. Amentar's mere presence is sufficient to corrupt the minds of other Necrons, driving them toward the same nihilistic madness that consumes the destroyer cults. From the humblest warrior to the noblest overlord, no Necron is safe from the infectious despair that radiates from Amentar's corrupted form. Worse still, Amentar has developed an obsession with the Citan known as the Nightbringer, the most deadly of the star gods and the entity that implanted the concept of death itself into the racial memory of every species in the galaxy. Amentar seeks to reunite the scattered shards of the Nightbringer, to reassemble the star god in its full and terrible glory. This goal is opposed by virtually every other faction in the galaxy, including, and perhaps most aggressively, by the Necrons themselves, who have no desire to see their former masters restored to full power. But Amentar persists, driven by a purpose so dark and so absolute that it has become the defining feature of its existence. The Destroyers, in their own terrible way, represent the logical conclusion of the Necron condition. They are what happens when immortal beings confront the full weight of eternity without the spiritual resources to endure it. They are the answer to the question that every self-aware Necron secretly dreads. What happens when you have nothing left to hope for? But the Necron's fears extend beyond the internal, beyond the madnesses and curses that plague their own kind. Some of their deepest terrors come from the outside, from forces that threaten not just individual Necrons or individual dynasties, but the entire species and everything it hopes to achieve. Chief among these external fears is the warp. The Necrons do not have souls. This is, depending on your perspective, either the greatest tragedy of their existence or their single most significant strategic advantage. Because while the loss of their souls has condemned them to an eternity of diminished consciousness and spiritual emptiness, it has also made them fundamentally immune to the one force in the galaxy that every other intelligent species must contend with, the corrupting influence of chaos. The warp is a dimension of pure psychic energy, a roiling sea of emotion and thought given form and substance and terrible, predatory intent. It is the source of all psychic powers in the galaxy, the medium through which psychers channel their abilities, the highway that allows faster-than-light travel for those brave or desperate enough to use it. It is also the home of entities so malevolent, so powerful, and so fundamentally opposed to the ordered existence of the material universe that their very touch can corrupt reality itself. The four great chaos gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, sit at the heart of this Imperium maelstrom, each one an expression of some fundamental aspect of mortal emotion, amplified to cosmic proportions and given a will of its own. The Necrons cannot be corrupted by chaos. They have no souls for the dark gods to tempt, no emotions for the whispers of the warp to exploit, no psychic presence that the denizens of the Imperium can latch onto and twist to their purposes. In the grand cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between the material universe and the nightmarish realm that mirrors it, the Necrons occupy a unique position. They are the one force in the galaxy that chaos cannot touch directly. It cannot corrupt, cannot turn against itself through the usual methods of temptation and manipulation. But this immunity comes at a terrible cost, and the cost is what generates fear. Because the Necrons have no connection to the warp, they have no psykers. In a galaxy where psychic power is one of the most potent weapons available, where entire species have built their civilizations around the ability to manipulate the energies of the Imperium, the Necrons are fundamentally disadvantaged. They cannot use the warp for travel, which means they are denied the galaxy's fastest and most common method of moving between star systems. Without access to the webway, a network they can only access through stolen technology in the form of dolmen gates, the Necrons would be condemned to travel at speeds that, or while impressive by the standards of purely material propulsion, are glacially slow compared to warp travel. More importantly, the Necrons are vulnerable to psychic attack in ways that their formidable physical defenses cannot address. Their living metal bodies can absorb staggering amounts of conventional damage, regenerating from wounds that would destroy any lesser being. But psychic energy operates on a different axis entirely. It attacks not the body, but the mind, the consciousness, the fundamental substrate of awareness that animates the Necron form. And because the Necrons have no psychic defenses of their own, no warp-derived shielding, no null fields, no way to fight fire with fire, they are disproportionately vulnerable to enemies who can channel the energies of the Imperium against them. Or think about what that means in practical terms. A Necron overlord, a being of such physical power that it can crush a space marine in full power armor with one hand, a being whose living metal body can regenerate from almost any wound, a being whose tactical acumen has been refined over millennia of warfare can be brought to its knees by a single Imperial psyker channeling a blast of warp energy. The Overlord's body will repair itself from physical damage. It cannot repair itself from psychic assault. The energies of the warp interact with the engrammatic pathways that house the Overlord's consciousness in ways that no amount of living metal can buffer against. It is as if the Necrons were built with an armor that protects against every weapon except the one that their enemies are most likely to use. The dolmen gates are a perfect illustration of this desperation. When the Necrons lost access to the warp as a medium of travel, they needed an alternative. The webway, that vast extra-dimensional network of tunnels and pathways that the old ones had woven through the fabric of reality over millions of years, offered a solution. But the webway was not designed for the Necrons. It was built by their enemies, attuned to their enemies' psychic signatures, and protected by wards and barriers that were specifically designed to keep soulless beings out. So the Necrons did what the Necrons always do when faced with a problem they cannot solve elegantly. They forced their way through with brute technological power. The dolmen gates are devices that quite literally tear holes in the walls of the webway, creating crude entry points that allow Necron vessels to enter the network and travel between distant points in the galaxy far faster than conventional propulsion would allow. But these gates are unstable, unreliable, and deeply resented by the webway's original custodians. The Elder regard Necron incursions into the webway as a violation of the highest order, an act of desecration comparable to breaking into a temple and tracking mud across the sacred floor. The Harlequins, those mysterious Eldar who serve the Laughing God and guard the webway's most secret passages, wage a constant guerrilla war against Necron forces that use the dolmen gates, ambushing them in the labyrinthine corridors between realities and doing everything in their power to seal the breaches that Necron technology creates. The result is that the Necron's primary method of faster-than-light travel is contested, unreliable, and comes with the constant risk of ambush by enemies who know the terrain far better than they do. It is as if the only highway connecting your cities passed through enemy territory, and every time you tried to use it, you had to fight your way through opponents who had been living there for millions of years and knew every shortcut, every hiding place, and every choke point along the route. This stands in stark contrast to the ease with which other species traverse the galaxy. The Imperium of Man, for all the dangers of warp travel, can move its fleets across the galaxy in weeks or months through the Imperium. The Eldar can slip through the webway like ghosts, yet appearing and disappearing with a grace and speed that makes the Necrons' brute force approach look clumsy by comparison. Even the Orcs, whose understanding of physics is, at best, creative, can travel faster than the Necrons through sheer psychic conviction that their ramshackle ships are fast enough to get where they need to go. The Necrons, the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy, are also the slowest to move across it. Their fleets crawl through real space or force their way through stolen webway corridors, always slower, always more cumbersome, always at a strategic disadvantage against enemies who can concentrate their forces with a speed and flexibility that the Necrons simply cannot match. This limitation has profound strategic implications. When a tomb world is threatened, reinforcements from allied dynasties cannot arrive quickly. When an opportunity for conquest presents itself, the window may close before a Necron fleet can reach its target. When the Tyranids descend upon a sector, the Necrons cannot rapidly redeploy forces from other parts of the galaxy to meet the threat. They are, in a very real sense, prisoners of distance, trapped by the vastness of a galaxy they once ruled, but can no longer traverse with the speed their strategic needs demand. The Old Ones understood this. During the War in Heaven, they created species specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability. The Eldar were engineered with the most powerful psychic potential of any species in the galaxy, capable of channeling warp energy with a precision and power that made them devastating opponents for the soulless Necrons. The Krork, but the ancestors of the modern Orcs, possessed a collective psychic field so powerful that it could literally reshape reality according to their shared beliefs, a phenomenon that defies any attempt at rational analysis, but which proved devastatingly effective on the battlefield. Even the lesser species created by the Old Ones, the Canib and the Rashan and the Jokairo, were given some connection to the warp that the Necrons could not counter. The Old Ones, in essence, had identified the Necrons' blind spot and built an entire arsenal around it. The species that populate the galaxy today, the ones that the Necrons must now contend with as they awaken from their long sleep, are, in many cases, literal weapons designed specifically to counter Necron strengths. The Eldar's psychic powers, the Orcs' collective psychic field, as even humanity's growing population of psykers, all of these are legacies of the Old Ones' strategy during the War in Heaven. The Necrons are fighting against enemies that were, in a very real sense, designed to kill them. This vulnerability drove the Necrons to develop what may be their most strategically significant technology, the Blackstone pylons. Blackstone, known in High Gothic as Noctilith, is a mysterious substance with the remarkable ability to nullify psychic energy. When shaped and charged correctly, Blackstone can create regions of space that are completely cut off from the warp, zones where psychic powers fail, where warp travel is impossible, where the influence of chaos simply ceases to exist. The Necrons have been constructing Blackstone pylons for millions of years, seeding them across the galaxy during the War in Heaven as part of a grand strategy to neutralize the Old Ones' greatest advantage, their mastery of the warp. The most famous of these pylon networks was on Cadia, the fortress world that guarded the only stable passage out of the Eye of Terror. For millennia, the Cadian pylons held the Great Warp Rift in check, preventing it from expanding and consuming the surrounding sectors. When Abaddon the Despoiler launched his 13th Black Crusade and ultimately destroyed Cadia by crashing a Blackstone fortress into its surface, the pylons were shattered, and the Eye of Terror erupted outward, spawning the Great Rift that now bisects the entire galaxy. The destruction of the Cadian pylons was a catastrophe for the Necrons, though the Imperium was too consumed by its own crisis to notice. The pylon network represented millions of years of careful construction, a planetary-scale defense system designed to hold back the very force that the Necrons feared most. Its loss demonstrated a terrible vulnerability. The Necrons' anti-warp technology, for all its power, was not invulnerable. It could be destroyed, and with it, the barriers that kept the nightmare realm of chaos at bay. The Great Rift, known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, now cleaves the galaxy in two, a wound in the fabric of reality that stretches from the Eye of Terror to the very edge of the galactic disk. Warp storms rage along its length, demonic incursions pour through its fractures, and the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides Imperial ships through the warp, can barely penetrate the interference it generates. For the Imperium, the Great Rift is a catastrophe of unprecedented magnitude, cutting off half the galaxy from the light of the Emperor and plunging billions of worlds into a darkness that breeds corruption, despair, and the endless predation of chaos. For the Necrons, the Great Rift represents something subtly different, but equally terrifying. It is evidence that the warp is winning, that the careful, patient work of containing the Immaterium's influence, work that the Necrons have been engaged in for millions of years, is being undone. The pylons on Cadia were not the only anti-warp devices the Necrons built. They are part of a vast network that spans the galaxy, a web of blackstone constructs designed to maintain the barrier between the material universe and the realm of chaos. The destruction of even one node in that network weakens the whole, and the creation of the Great Rift may have caused cascading failures in pylon networks across thousands of light-years, weakening the barriers between dimensions in ways that have not yet been fully catalogued. Some cryptechs have theorized that the Great Rift, if left unchecked, could eventually expand to encompass the entire galaxy, transforming all of real space into an extension of the warp. If this happens, the Necrons would find themselves stranded in a sea of psychic energy, their soulless bodies immune to corruption, but surrounded on all sides by a dimension that they cannot interact with, cannot navigate, and cannot escape. They would become islands of order in an ocean of chaos, slowly ground down by the ceaseless assault of a realm that is hostile to their very existence. In response to this setback, the Silent King and his Sarek dynasty have embarked on an ambitious new project, the Pariah Nexus. This is a vast network of newly constructed blackstone pylons deployed across an entire sector of space, creating a region where the warp's influence has been almost completely suppressed. Within the Pariah Nexus, psychic powers fail, demonic entities cannot manifest, and the living creatures unfortunate enough to be caught within its boundaries find themselves overwhelmed by a numbing despair that gradually strips away their will to live, leaving them as vacant, mindless husks. The Pariah Nexus serves multiple purposes for the Necrons. It protects their territory from the encroachment of chaos. It weakens any living enemies who venture within its bounds. And, perhaps most importantly for the Silent King's grand design, as it creates the conditions necessary for experiments on reversing biotransference, providing a sterile, warp-free environment where the delicate process of transferring consciousness from metal back to flesh might theoretically be attempted. But the effects of the Pariah Nexus on living beings are deeply disturbing, and they raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of what the Necrons are trying to achieve. Organic creatures, caught within the Nexus's sphere of influence, experience a progressive deadening of their emotional and spiritual faculties. The connection to the warp that every living being possesses, the thread of psychic energy that links consciousness to the broader Immaterium, is severed. The result is a gradual, soul-crushing loss of motivation, empathy, creativity, and will. People within the Nexus stop caring about things. They stop dreaming. They stop hoping. They go through the motions of existence with a mechanical detachment that bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the Necron condition itself. The Imperial forces who have fought in the Pariah Nexus have reported this effect with growing alarm. Guardsmen lose the will to fight. Space Marines, their superhuman resilience tested to its limits, find their battle rage dimming and their sense of purpose fading. Even the most devout servants of the Emperor discover that their faith, usually an unshakable anchor in times of crisis, becomes hollow and meaningless within the Nexus's influence. The Pariah Nexus does not kill people, at least not directly. It simply makes them stop wanting to be alive. The irony is almost too perfect. The Necrons, in their effort to create a safe space for their experiments in restoring organic life, have created a region of space that is actively hostile to everything that makes organic life worth having. The Pariah Nexus is a preview of what a Necron-dominated galaxy might look like: orderly, stable, free from the corrupting influence of chaos, and utterly devoid of the spiritual richness that makes consciousness meaningful. It is a glimpse of a future that is technically alive but experientially dead, and for those with the eyes to see it, it is perhaps the most damning indictment of the Necron condition that exists anywhere in the galaxy. But the Pariah Nexus is also a testament to fear. Its construction is not the project of a confident, secure civilization. It is the desperate measure of a species that knows it is vulnerable, yet that understands on a fundamental level that the warp represents a threat it cannot defeat through conventional military force. The Necrons are building walls against the warp, not because they are strong, but because they are afraid of the Chaos Gods whose influence they cannot counter through their usual methods, afraid of the Great Rift whose expansion threatens to swallow entire sectors of their territory, afraid of a dimension of existence that they cannot perceive, cannot navigate, cannot manipulate, and cannot defend against without resorting to the construction of galaxy-spanning engineering projects of staggering scale and complexity. The warp is the Necrons' blind spot, the one arena where their technological supremacy counts for almost nothing. And in a galaxy where the boundaries between the material universe and the immaterium are growing thinner with every passing century, where the Great Rift continues to spew demonic entities and warp storms into real space with increasing frequency, this blind spot is becoming an existential threat. But even the warp, for all the fear it generates among the Necron hierarchy, is not the thing that frightens them most. That distinction belongs to a threat so vast, so implacable, and so fundamentally opposed to everything the Necrons are trying to achieve that it drove the Silent King himself to abandon 60 million years of self-imposed exile and return to a galaxy he had sworn never to set foot in again. The Tyranids. To understand why the Tyranids represent the ultimate fear for the Necron species, you have to understand what the Silent King wants. Not what the Necron dynasties want in general, with their varied and often contradictory agendas of conquest and expansion and political maneuvering, but what Sarek himself, the last and most powerful of the Silent Kings, the being who bears the weight of 60 million years of guilt for what he did to his people, actually hopes to achieve. Sarek wants to undo biotransference. He wants to find a way to restore his people to organic form, to give them back the flesh and blood and souls that the Satan stole. This is his great work, the purpose that has sustained his consciousness through eons of exile in the void between galaxies, the dream that has kept the flickering remnant of his identity from succumbing to the same madness that claims so many of his kind. He does not fight for territory or glory or vengeance. He fights for redemption, for the chance to correct the most catastrophic mistake in the history of intelligent life. For this dream to have any chance of success, the galaxy needs to contain living species. Specifically, it needs to contain species whose organic forms might serve as suitable vessels for the transfer of Necron consciousness back into biological bodies. The details of how this might work are unclear, and the ethical implications are staggering. Essentially, Sarek's plan may require the subjugation or exploitation of entire species to provide the organic raw material for a process of reverse biotransference. But regardless of the moral calculus, the fundamental prerequisite is the same. there need to be living things in the galaxy. There need to be biological organisms whose genetic architecture is sophisticated enough to house the vast, complex consciousness of a Necron mind. Now imagine you are Zarek. Imagine you have spent 60 million years in the void between galaxies, carrying the weight of your crime and the hope of your redemption through the absolute darkness of intergalactic space. Imagine you are the only Necron who fully remembers his past as an organic being, the only one who can recall with perfect clarity what it felt like to have a body of flesh and blood, to breathe, to eat, to feel the warmth of a star on living skin. Imagine that every moment of your existence is shadowed by the knowledge that you are the one who made the decision. You are the one who accepted the Satan's bargain. You are the one who led your entire species into the bio-furnaces and watched as their souls were consumed. The guilt would have destroyed any lesser mind. It nearly destroyed Zarek, but he held on, sustained by a single, unwavering purpose: to find a way to undo what he had done, to give his people back their souls, their bodies, their lives, to make right the most catastrophic wrong in the history of intelligent existence. For 60 million years, that purpose kept him going. Through the empty darkness between galaxies, through eons of solitude and regret, and the crushing weight of responsibility for the suffering of trillions, Zarek clung to the dream of redemption. It was all he had. It was the only thing that stood between him and the same nihilistic despair that claims the destroyers. And then imagine you are finally returning to the Milky Way, finally preparing to put your great plan into motion, to wake your sleeping people and begin the long, difficult work of undoing the damage you wrought upon them all those eons ago. And then imagine you encounter the Tyranids. The encounter happened in the intergalactic void, in the vast darkness between galaxies, where nothing should have existed but empty space and cosmic radiation. The exact details of how Zarek discovered the Tyranids remain shrouded in mystery, and the Silent King has not been forthcoming about the specifics. Some have speculated that he detected their approach through long-range sensors aboard the Song of Oblivion. Others suggest that he physically encountered Tyranid organisms, the scout forms sent ahead of the main hive fleets to map the biomass of the Milky Way before the full swarm arrived. Whatever the truth, the effect was immediate and decisive. Zarek broke his oath of exile and turned back toward the galaxy he had sworn to leave behind forever. The fact that the Tyranids were drawn to the galaxy at all may be partly the fault of the Imperium. The Pharaohs, a Necron device on the world of Sotha that was accidentally activated during the Horus heresy, sent out a burst of energy so powerful that it was detectable across intergalactic distances. The Tyranids, with their ability to sense such emanations, may have locked onto this signal and altered their course to investigate its source. If this theory is correct, then the most existential threat to the Necrons' dream of redemption was triggered, at least in part, by the careless actions of the very species that the Necrons need to survive. The Tyranids are not like any other threat the Necrons have faced. They are not an empire to be conquered, not a rival civilization to be outmaneuvered, not a military force to be defeated through superior firepower and tactical acumen. They are a biological apocalypse, a galaxy-spanning swarm of organisms so numerous that they blot out the stars, so adaptable that they can counter any weapon and overcome any defense given sufficient time, so ravenous that they consume everything, absolutely everything, organic on every world they touch. They strip planets bare of biomass, leaving behind nothing but barren rock and empty oceans, before moving on to the next world, the next system, the next sector, always hungry, always growing, always adapting. Yet the manner of their arrival is itself a thing of horror. A Tyranid hive fleet does not simply appear in a star system like a conventional enemy fleet dropping out of the warp. It is preceded by the shadow in the warp, a bow wave of psychic interference so intense that it disrupts all warp-based communication and travel across entire sectors before the first Tyranid organism even becomes visible on long-range sensors. Astropaths, the psychers who serve as the Imperium's primary means of interstellar communication, go mad or die when the shadow in the warp falls over them, their minds overwhelmed by the sheer alien presence of the hive mind. Navigation through the warp becomes impossible, trapping any ships in the system and cutting them off from reinforcement. By the time the vanguard organisms arrive, the planet is already isolated, already cut off, already alone. For the Necrons, the shadow in the warp is less directly threatening because they do not rely on psychic communication or warp travel to the same degree as other species. But its implications are still deeply troubling. The fact that the hive mind can project a psychic presence of such magnitude that it disrupts an entire dimension of existence suggests a scale of consciousness that dwarfs anything else in the galaxy. The hive mind is not merely smart. It is not merely tactically competent. It is a single, unified intelligence that spans the entire Tyranid species, that coordinates billions upon billions of individual organisms across light years of space, with a speed and precision that makes the most sophisticated Necron command network look primitive by comparison. And then there is the question of scale. Was what the galaxy has seen of the Tyranids so far, the hive fleets that have invaded Imperial space over the past few centuries, may represent only a tiny fraction of the total Tyranid biomass. The hive fleets are tendrils, probing fingers of a much larger organism that exists in the intergalactic void, its true size and shape unknown and perhaps unknowable. Some projections suggest that the main body of the Tyranid swarm contains more biomass than all the organic life in the galaxy combined. If this is true, then the battles that have been fought against the Tyranids so far are not wars. They are preliminary skirmishes, initial probes by a predator that is still in the process of deciding how best to consume its prey. The Necrons, with their ancient senses and their vast intelligence networks, may have a better understanding of the Tyranids' true scale than any other species in the galaxy. And if they do, then the fear they feel is not merely the fear of a powerful enemy. It is the fear of something so vast and so implacable that the concept of defeating it is meaningless. You do not defeat the ocean. You do not conquer gravity. You do not win a war against the fundamental processes of the universe. And the Tyranids, in their own terrible way, may be exactly that, a fundamental process, a biological law of nature, a force of cosmic predation that will not stop because it cannot stop, because consumption is not its strategy, but its nature, not its choice, but its identity. The connection between the Tyranids' arrival and Necron technology adds another layer of irony to the situation. The Pharaoh's device, a Necron artifact of immense power located on the world of Sotha, was activated during the Horus Heresy by human forces who did not fully understand what they were manipulating. The resulting burst of energy, a beacon of incredible intensity that blazed across not just the galaxy, but across the intergalactic void, is believed by many to be what drew the Tyranids' attention to the Milky Way in the first place. The signal that summoned the greatest biological threat the galaxy has ever known was generated by Necron technology, operated by human hands, in a conflict the Necrons had no part in. It is one of the cruelest ironies in a universe that seems to specialize in them. The Necrons' own technology may have called down the very force that threatens to destroy their last hope of salvation. And the Pharaoh's device was originally designed as a navigational beacon, a tool for guiding Necron ships across the galaxy during the age before the Great Sleep. It operated by projecting a signal through a dimensional frequency that transcended conventional physics, allowing it to be detected across distances that would render any normal communication method useless. The Ultramarines who discovered it during the Horus Heresy recognized its utility as a substitute for the Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic lighthouse that guided Imperial navigation through the warp, and they pressed it into service without fully understanding the risks. When the Night Lords, a Chaos Space Marine Legion, attacked Sotha to destroy the Pharaohs, the resulting battle caused a catastrophic overload of the device. The beacon flared to its maximum output in a blinding pulse of energy that propagated outward in all directions at superluminal speeds. This pulse reached far beyond the boundaries of the Milky Way, far into the intergalactic void, where something vast and hungry and patient was waiting in the darkness between galaxies. The Tyranids, whatever they are, wherever they came from, heard the signal and turned toward its source, with the slow, implacable certainty of a predator that has detected the scent of prey on the wind. The Necrons did not create the pharaohs with the intention of summoning the Tyranids. They could not have anticipated that their navigational technology would one day be misused by a species that did not even exist when the device was built. But the consequences of this accident fall disproportionately upon the Necrons themselves, more because it is the Necrons whose hope of salvation is most directly threatened by the Tyranid advance. The humans who activated the Pharos will suffer from the Tyranid invasion, certainly, but they do not face the same existential stakes. The Imperium fights the Tyranids to survive. The Necrons fight the Tyranids to save their very possibility of becoming something more than what they currently are. If the Tyranids succeed, if they consume all the biomass in the Milky Way, the Necrons' plan for reverse biotransference dies with it. There will be no organic species left to serve as vessels. There will be no biological material from which to construct new bodies. There will be nothing but the Necrons themselves, trapped forever in their metal shells, condemned to an eternity of soulless existence, with no possibility of escape. The dream of redemption, the one thing that gives meaning to the Necrons' continued existence, will have been devoured along with everything else. This is why Zarek returned, not out of altruism, not out of concern for the living species of the galaxy, but out of the cold, calculating realization that if the Tyranids were not stopped, everything he had worked for across 60 million years would be rendered meaningless. The Tyranids are not merely an enemy to the Necrons. They are the enemy, the one threat that strikes directly at the heart of the Necrons' most fundamental aspiration. The Silent King encountered the Tyranid hive fleets in the intergalactic void, in the vast darkness between galaxies, where nothing should have existed but empty space and cosmic radiation. The exact circumstances of this encounter are shrouded in mystery, and there are those among the Necrons who question the official account. How did Zarek, traveling through the immeasurable emptiness of the void, happen to encounter the Tyranids? How did he recognize the magnitude of the threat they posed? What else did he see out there, in the darkness between the stars, that convinced him to break his oath of exile and return to a galaxy he had abandoned? These questions have answers that Zarek has not chosen to share. When other Necrons press him on the details of his time in the void, they are deflected, distracted, or in some cases, taken by the Triarch Praetorians and never seen again. The Silent King keeps his secrets, and the reasons for his secrecy are themselves a source of unease among the Necron hierarchy. What is not in question is the scope of the Tyranid threat. What the hive fleets that have entered the Milky Way represent, by most estimates, only a fraction of the total Tyranid biomass. The full swarm, the entire species in all its incomprehensible vastness, is something that beggars the imagination. Each hive fleet is a self-contained ecosystem, a traveling world of biological matter that can grow, adapt, reproduce, and evolve at speeds that make natural selection look like a glacier. The Tyranids have no technology in the conventional sense, no machines or vehicles or artificial structures. They do not need them. Their biology is their technology, refined over unknown eons of evolution into weapons and tools and organisms of staggering efficiency and lethality. The Necrons' usual advantages count for very little against the Tyranids. Gauss weaponry, which strips matter apart atom by atom, and is devastatingly effective against individual Tyranid organisms, but the swarm simply absorbs the losses and produces replacements faster than the Necrons can destroy them. Living metal, which allows Necron warriors to regenerate from terrible wounds, means nothing when the Tyranids can simply overwhelm through sheer numbers, burying their enemies under mountains of chitinous flesh. Even the Necrons' most powerful superweapons, their star-killing devices and planet-cracking weapons, are of limited use against an enemy that exists as a distributed network of organisms spread across entire sectors of space. You can kill 1 billion Tyranids and barely dent the swarm. You can exterminate a world that they have targeted, and they will simply redirect to the next one on their list. As the Tyranids also pose a unique tactical challenge for the Necrons in that they offer no biomass in return for the effort of destroying them. When the Necrons fight other species, the battlefield at least retains some organic residue, some remnant of the living world that existed before the conflict began. When the Necrons fight the Tyranids, the battlefield is stripped clean. The Tyranids consume their own dead as readily as they consume the enemy's, recycling every gram of biomass back into the swarm with an efficiency that would impress even the most meticulous cryptech. This creates a nightmare scenario for the Necrons. Every battle against the Tyranids, whether won or lost, costs the Necrons something they cannot replace, while giving the Tyranids something they can always regenerate. The mathematics of attrition favor the swarm in every conceivable scenario. The Necrons cannot reproduce. They cannot create new Necrons to replace those lost in battle. What they have now is all they will ever have, unless they find a way to reverse biotransference, which requires the very organic life that the Tyranids are in the process of devouring. It is a trap, a cosmic-scale trap of the cruelest possible design, and the Silent King can see every element of it with crystalline clarity. The Tyranids devour the biomass that the Necrons need to save themselves. Fighting the Tyranids costs the Necrons warriors they cannot replace. Not fighting the Tyranids allows them to continue consuming the galaxy unchecked. There is no winning strategy, no optimal solution, no clever tactical maneuver that resolves the fundamental dilemma. But the best the Necrons can hope for is to slow the Tyranids down, to buy time for the great work of reverse biotransference, to pray, if beings without souls can pray, that there will still be enough organic life left in the galaxy when the process is finally perfected for it to matter. The fear of the Tyranids is the fear of inevitability. It is the fear that no matter how powerful you are, no matter how advanced your technology, no matter how vast your legions and how brilliant your strategies, there exists a force in the universe that is simply too big, too numerous, too adaptable, and too relentless to defeat. It is the fear that the galaxy itself is dying, being consumed from the outside by a hunger that makes even the Flayer virus look like a mild appetite, and that the Necrons, for all their godlike power, may be helpless to stop it. There is an interesting wrinkle in the relationship between the Necrons and the Tyranids that adds another layer of complexity to this fear. Tyranid hive fleets have been observed in some accounts, apparently avoiding Necron tomb worlds. They pass them by, redirecting their tendrils to consume worlds that offer biomass, while leaving the dead, metal-filled worlds of the Necrons untouched. The reasons for this behavior are debated among those who study both species. Some believe the Tyranids simply recognize that tomb worlds offer no biomass worth the effort of conquest, that their hive mind, in its cold biological calculus, has determined that attacking a Necron world produces no return on the energy invested. Others theorize that there is something about the Necrons themselves, their soulless nature, their anti-warp properties, the residual influence of the Satan technology that permeates their worlds, that actively repels the Tyranid hive mind, creating a kind of psychic dead zone that the Tyranid's senses cannot penetrate or prefer to avoid. The outsider, the Satan driven mad by consuming its own kin, is an extreme example of this repellent effect. Tyranid hive fleets approaching the outsider's Dyson sphere in the intergalactic void have been observed deviating from their course to go around it, giving the mad star god a wide berth. Whether this is due to the outsider's immense power, its anti-warp properties, or some other factor entirely, is unknown. But the fact that the Tyranids, creatures that devour everything in their path with mechanical efficiency, go out of their way to avoid the outsider suggests that there are forces in the galaxy that even the Great Devourer respects. But even if the Tyranids avoid individual tomb worlds, they are still consuming the galaxy around those worlds. They are still devouring the biomass that the Necrons need. They are still growing, still adapting, still spreading with the inexorable momentum of a force that has been honed across unknown eons of evolution in whatever distant corner of the universe spawned them. The tomb worlds may survive the passage of a hive fleet, but the living worlds around them will not, and without those living worlds, the Necrons' dream of reversing biotransference dies. Zarek has fought battles against the Tyranids. Yeah, he allied with the Blood Angel Space Marine chapter during the Gehenna campaign, when both forces were threatened by a Tyranid incursion, setting aside the enmity between Necron and human to face a common enemy. The battle on Gehenna in 955 of the 41st Millennium is one of the few recorded instances of Necron and Imperial forces fighting alongside each other, and it speaks volumes about the depth of the crisis. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels and the Silent King stood on the same battlefield, directing their forces against a common foe, two ancient powers temporarily united by the recognition that the Tyranids threatened them both. After the battle was won, Zarek allowed the Blood Angels to leave unmolested, despite having the clear military capability to destroy them. This act of restraint is almost unprecedented in Necron history. The Silent King does not form alliances lightly. He does not cooperate with lesser species unless the stakes are high enough to justify the compromise. He certainly does not let potential enemies walk away from a battlefield when he could easily destroy them. The fact that he was willing to fight alongside Blood Angels, to stand shoulder to shoulder with organic beings whose existence he has every reason to resent and then let them leave alive, tells you everything you need to know about how seriously he takes the Tyranid threat. The Silent King's broader strategy against the Tyranids is characteristically subtle and long-term. He does not simply throw his legions at the hive fleets in direct confrontation, though he is willing to do so when necessary. Instead, he works from the shadows, manipulating the younger races of the galaxy into positions where they will serve as bulwarks against the Tyranid advance. He uses the Triarch Praetorians as his agents, awakening dormant tomb worlds and placing them in strategic positions to disrupt Tyranid supply lines and migration patterns. He nudges Imperial forces toward engagements with hive fleets, using the Imperium's vast but expendable armies as a buffer between the Tyranids and the worlds he intends to claim. One of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of Zarek's anti-Tyranid strategy is the Octarius War. The Octarius sector was a region of space dominated by a massive Orc empire, billions upon billions of greenskins settled across dozens of worlds, a self-sustaining ecosystem of violence and reproduction that had persisted for centuries. When the Death Watch, the Imperium's elite Xenos hunting force, diverted a tendril of hive fleet Leviathan into the Octarius sector, hoping that the two threats would destroy each other, the result was something far worse than anyone had anticipated. The Orcs and the Tyranids fed each other. The Orcs grew larger and more powerful from fighting the Tyranids, while the Tyranids consumed Orc biomass and evolved new adaptations to counter greenskin tactics. The war escalated constantly, each side pushing the other to greater heights of violence and capability, and the winner of such a conflict, whichever it turned out to be, would emerge as a threat of unprecedented magnitude. The Silent King watched the Octarius War with what might, in a being capable of emotion, be called horror. Yet here was a living demonstration of exactly what he feared most: two enemies growing stronger through conflict, with the survivor potentially becoming too powerful for anyone, even the Necrons, to stop. The Tyranids that emerged from the Octarius War would be stronger, more adapted, more dangerous than any hive fleet the galaxy had previously seen. They would have spent years or decades evolving specifically to overcome the toughest, most resilient organic opponents available, and the lessons learned in the crucible of Octarius would be transmitted through the hive mind to every other tendril and splinter fleet in the galaxy. The strategic implications of the Octarius situation illustrate the impossible position the Necrons find themselves in regarding the Tyranids. Okay, helping the Imperium fight the Tyranids might save organic worlds that the Necrons eventually need, but it also risks feeding the Tyranids more biomass if the campaigns go poorly. Letting the younger races handle the problem on their own risks catastrophic failures that allow the Tyranids to consume sectors wholesale. And direct Necron intervention, while tactically effective, costs the Necrons warriors they cannot replace, while the Tyranids simply absorb the lessons of each defeat and adapt. It is the Silent King's greatest fear that the younger races' flawed attempts to fight the Tyranids will simply feed the hive fleets more biomass, making them stronger rather than weaker. Every world that falls to the Tyranids increases their available resources, as every army that is consumed adds its biological data to the hive mind's ever-growing library of adaptive responses. Even victories against the Tyranids are partial at best, as the swarm absorbs the lessons of defeat and evolves to counter the strategies that defeated it. The Tyranids learn from their losses. The Necrons cannot afford theirs. But beyond the external threats, beyond the Tyranids and the warp and the enemies that besiege the Necron Empire from without, there is another fear that gnaws at the foundations of Necron civilization. A fear that is not dramatic or spectacular, that does not involve grand battles or cosmic confrontations, but that may ultimately prove more destructive than all the others combined. The fear of entropy. The fear of slow, inevitable, irreversible decay. As the Necrons went to sleep 60 million years ago, they entered their stasis crypts, expecting to awaken to a galaxy ripe for reconquest, a galaxy where their enemies had weakened and their own forces remained intact and ready for battle. That is not what they found. Many tomb worlds are gone, destroyed by cosmic disasters, asteroid impacts, tectonic instabilities, or the simple erosion of time on systems that were designed to last for millennia, not for geological ages. Others were discovered and looted or destroyed by alien species who stumbled upon them during the long sleep, the Eldar chief among them, who recognized the Necrons for the threat they represented and took steps to eliminate tomb worlds wherever they found them. Still others survived physically but suffered catastrophic failures in their stasis systems, or resulting in the loss of millions of Necrons whose bodies simply failed during the long dormancy, their necrodermis degrading, their engrammatic pathways corroding, their consciousness flickering out like candles in a wind that blew for 60 million years. The Necrons who do awaken often find themselves diminished. Their memories are damaged, their personalities altered, their cognitive functions impaired by the accumulated errors of millennia upon millennia of stasis. The nobility retain the most of their former selves, but even among the overlords and pharaohs, the ravages of time have taken a toll. Some emerge from the Great Sleep, with their personalities intact, but exaggerated, their pre-existing quirks and obsessions amplified to the point of dysfunction. Others emerge with entirely new delusions, so their perception of reality warped by stasis-induced cognitive damage into something that bears little resemblance to objective truth. The canoptech constructs, those tireless mechanical servants that were left to watch over the tomb worlds during the Great Sleep, have done their best to maintain the stasis systems and repair the damage caused by the passage of time. Scarabs, spiders, and wraiths have patrolled the corridors of the tomb worlds for 60 million years, maintaining, repairing, defending against intruders, performing the thankless and unending work of keeping a sleeping civilization alive. But even the canoptech constructs have their limits. Some tomb worlds suffered catastrophic failures that no amount of robotic maintenance could repair. There's seismic events that shattered stasis crypts and scattered their occupants across rubble-filled chambers, water infiltration that corroded vital systems, power failures that lasted for centuries or millennia, while the canoptech constructs worked frantically to restore function. On some worlds, the canoptech constructs themselves failed, their own systems degrading over the eons until they could no longer perform their duties. Without maintenance, the tomb world systems deteriorated rapidly, and the Necrons sleeping within were left to the mercy of entropy. Some were simply destroyed, their bodies crumbling to metallic dust over the course of millions of years. Others survived in a physical sense, but with their neural pathways so degraded that they awoke as little more than mindless shells, incapable of thought or action, wandering the corridors of their tomb world in an eternal, purposeless loop. The Eldar were particularly effective at finding and destroying Necron tomb worlds during the long sleep. They remembered the war in heaven. They remembered what the Necrons were capable of, and they were determined to ensure that as many of their ancient enemies as possible never awoke to threaten them again. Eldar raiding parties sought out tomb worlds and destroyed them with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, smashing stasis crypts, corrupting control systems, and in some cases, simply blowing the entire world apart. The number of Necrons lost to Eldar attacks during the Great Sleep is incalculable, but it was certainly in the billions. Other threats were more mundane but no less destructive. Asteroid impacts shattered the surfaces of tomb worlds, exposing the vaults beneath to the vacuum of space or the corrosive effects of atmospheric elements. Tectonic instabilities broke apart the carefully engineered caverns that housed the stasis crypts, crushing millions of sleeping Necrons beneath tons of collapsed rock. On some worlds, the very stars they orbited underwent changes, expanding into red giants or collapsing into white dwarves, bathing the tomb worlds in radiation levels that degraded their systems, or heating their surfaces to temperatures that melted the metal of their construction. And on other worlds, the newer species of the galaxy unwittingly settled above sleeping Necron legions, building cities and civilizations over vaults whose existence they did not suspect. When the Necrons beneath these worlds awaken, the result is often catastrophic, as a sudden eruption of silver legions from beneath the feet of startled populations who had no idea what slumbered beneath their streets and fields. These awakenings are frequently violent, chaotic, and devastating, as disoriented Necrons emerge from damaged stasis crypts into a world that is completely alien to anything they remember. Consider the tomb world of Damnos, where Imperial colonists had built a thriving civilization over a Necron tomb complex, without any awareness of what lay beneath their feet. When the Necrons of Damnos began to awaken, the result was a catastrophe that claimed millions of human lives and required the intervention of the Ultramarines Space Marine chapter to contain. The battle for Damnos became one of the most celebrated engagements in recent Imperial military history, but for the Necrons, and it was something quite different. A messy, disorganized awakening from a sleep that had lasted far longer than intended, into a world that had been irrevocably changed by the passage of time. The Necrons of Damnos did not emerge as a unified, coordinated military force ready for conquest. They emerged confused, damaged, and angry. Their stasis systems degraded, their numbers reduced, their tactical situation compromised by the presence of an enemy they had never anticipated. The awakening of each tomb world is unique, shaped by the specific conditions of its long dormancy. Some tomb worlds emerge largely intact, their stasis systems having performed flawlessly for 60 million years, their legions rising from the crypts as fresh and ready for battle as the day they entered them. These are the fortunate ones, the dynasties that can immediately begin the work of reconquest and territorial expansion. But they are the minority. The majority of tomb worlds awaken to discover some degree of damage, some loss of personnel, some degradation of systems or corruption of data that makes the process of reactivation more difficult, more painful, and more uncertain than it was ever supposed to be. Some tomb worlds awaken to discover that they are alone, that the dynasties they were once connected to, the networks of alliance and obligation that once gave them context and purpose within the broader Necron Empire, no longer exist. The tomb worlds they were supposed to coordinate with have been destroyed or have failed to awaken. The communication networks that once linked them to the wider galaxy are silent. Yet they emerge from 60 million years of sleep into a universe that has forgotten they exist, surrounded by alien species they have never encountered, cut off from any chain of command or source of guidance, forced to navigate a reality that bears no resemblance to the one they left behind. For a Necron overlord awakening in these circumstances, the experience is something close to the deepest conceivable loneliness. You are the last survivor of a dynasty that may have once numbered in the billions. Your subjects are damaged or destroyed. Your allies are gone. Your enemies are unknown. And the galaxy that stretches out before your optical sensors is a place of incomprehensible strangeness, filled with species that did not exist when you went to sleep, and governed by political realities that your 60-million-year-old strategic database cannot begin to process. Nemesor Zahandrech is perhaps the most poignant example. An overlord of the Sautek dynasty and a military genius of extraordinary capability, Zahandrech emerged from the Great Sleep believing that he is still a Necrontyr, that the wars of secession that consumed the Necrontyr Empire millions of years ago are still ongoing, and that the enemies he faces on the battlefield, the Orcs, the humans, the Eldar, are all rebellious Necrontyr warlords who must be brought to heel. He does not see reality as it is. He does not recognize what he has become. He fights with brilliant tactical acumen, wins battle after battle, and then treats his defeated enemies with the honor and courtesy appropriate to fellow Necrontyr nobles, because in his damaged mind, that is exactly what they are. His bodyguard, Vargard Oberon, is fully lucid and painfully aware of both Zahandrech's condition and the impossibility of correcting it. Oberon has long since abandoned any attempt to awaken his master to the truth, instead quietly managing the consequences of Zahandrech's delusions and ensuring that the Overlord's military genius is put to effective use regardless of the flawed premises upon which it operates. The relationship between these two figures is one of the most quietly tragic in all of Necron lore. A sane mind devoted to serving a brilliant one that has lost its grip on reality, knowing that there is no cure, no treatment, no possibility of recovery. Zahandrech's condition is extreme, but it is not unique. Across the awakening tomb worlds, Necron nobles are emerging from stasis with minds that do not function as they should. Some believe they are still fighting wars that ended before the planet Earth had formed. Others have become obsessed with collecting, cataloging, hoarding, or arranging objects with a compulsive intensity that consumes their entire existence. Still others have simply withdrawn into themselves, retreating into internal simulations and memories that bear no relationship to the world around them, effectively becoming conscious but non-functional, present in body but absent in every other meaningful sense. The fear is that this decay is not merely the result of damaged stasis systems or random mechanical failure. The fear is that it is inherent, that the Necron mind, be transplanted from organic tissue into engrammatic circuitry, was never meant to endure this long. That the architecture of consciousness, the fundamental structure of thought and personality and self-awareness, requires a biological substrate to maintain its integrity over time, and that without that substrate, it gradually, inevitably, breaks down. Like a building whose foundations are slowly dissolving, the structure may stand for a very long time, but eventually it will fall. Some Necron philosophers, if that term can be applied to beings who think in data streams and probability calculations, have theorized that the various madnesses that afflict the Necron species, the Flayer virus, the Destroyer cult, the eccentricities and delusions of the awakening nobility, are not separate conditions at all, but different expressions of the same underlying process. The process of consciousness degrading in the absence of the biological systems that were designed to support it. The process of minds that were never meant to exist in metal, slowly, inexorably losing the very qualities that make them minds at all. If this theory is correct, then the Necrons face a countdown that no technology can stop and no strategy can circumvent. Every century that passes sees a few more overlords succumb to madness, a few more warriors lose the last vestiges of their former selves, a few more tomb worlds fall into the grip of one or another of the conditions that plague the Necron race. The population shrinks. And not through battlefield casualties alone, but through the gradual attrition of minds that simply cannot hold themselves together any longer. The Necrons cannot make new Necrons. This fact, simple and devastating, underlies everything about their strategic situation. Unlike every other major species in the galaxy, the Necrons have no means of replenishment. Humans breed, orcs multiply through spores, Eldar, diminished as they are, still give birth to new generations. Even the Tyranids, who do not reproduce in the conventional sense, can generate new organisms from consumed biomass at rates that dwarf any other species' ability to replace its losses. The Necrons have none of these options. What they have now is all they will ever have. Every warrior destroyed in battle, every overlord who succumbs to madness, every tomb world that fails during the Great Sleep, represents a permanent and irreversible diminishment of the Necron species. There are no Necron children being born on Necron worlds. There are no academies training new Necron officers. There are no forges producing new Necron warriors. The biotransference process was a one-time event, a singular moment of transformation that converted the entire Necrontire species in a single catastrophic act. The knowledge of how to perform biotransference still exists in the archives of the cryptex, but there are no organic Necrontire remaining to undergo the process. And even if there were, the Necrons have learned, at a cost that beggars description, that biotransference is not a gift, but a curse. They would not wish it upon anyone, not even an enemy. This means that the Necron species exists in a state of permanent, irreversible decline. Every loss is final. Every casualty is a subtraction that can never be balanced by an addition. The curve is always downward, even if the descent is slow enough to be measured in centuries rather than years. A Necron strategist plotting the long-term trajectory of the species does not need to account for births, recruitment, or population growth. There are no positive variables in the equation. There is only the starting number and the rate of attrition, and the question of how long the starting number can withstand the attrition before it reaches zero. The mathematics are merciless. The Necrons began the Great Sleep as one of the largest civilizations in galactic history, numbering in the untold billions. After 60 million years of attrition, out of tomb world failures and stasis malfunctions and alien incursions, their numbers have been reduced significantly, though they are still vast by the standards of most species. But the trend is clear, and the trend is downward. Every century sees the Necron population shrink a little more. Every awakening reveals new losses, new failures, new gaps in the ranks where warriors and nobles once stood. This is the fear of entropy, the fear that time, the one force that the Necrons were supposed to have conquered through their transformation into immortal machines, is actually their greatest enemy. The fear that their immortality is not true immortality at all, but merely an extremely prolonged dying, a slow fade from relevance and existence that stretches across geological ages, but leads to the same destination as every mortal life: silence, emptiness, and the void. And entropy does not only affect the physical infrastructure of the tomb worlds or the neural pathways of individual Necrons. It also erodes the bonds that hold Necron civilization together. The political structures, the feudal hierarchies, the chains of loyalty and obligation that once gave the Necron Empire its cohesion, all of these are fraying as the centuries pass and the madness spreads. This is a fear that does not often receive the attention it deserves, but it is one that the most strategically minded Necron lords contemplate with deep unease. The fear of civil war. The fear that the Necron species, already diminished, already besieged on all sides by external threats, will tear itself apart from within. The Necron Empire is not a unified state. It never was, even during the days of the Necrontire. The Necrontire were a fractious, quarrelsome species whose political landscape was defined by the Wars of Secession, a series of devastating civil conflicts between rival dynasties that consumed resources, lives, and entire worlds in an endless cycle of ambition and revenge. These civil wars were one of the primary reasons the Necrontyr accepted the Citan's offer in the first place. A unified enemy, a common purpose, a shared cause that might finally bring the warring dynasties together. That it took the erasure of their souls to achieve this unity is one of the darker ironies of Necron history. When the Necrons awoke from the Great Sleep, they awoke as separate dynasties, each with its own pharaon, its own territories, its own agendas, and its own grudges. The Silent King had destroyed the command protocols that gave him absolute authority, which meant that no single ruler could compel obedience from the others. Zarek could request, persuade, threaten, and cajole, but he could not command. The result is a political landscape that is, in many ways, more dangerous than the external threats the Necrons face. The Sautek dynasty, under the leadership of the infamously ambitious Imhotep, the Stormlord, pursues a strategy of aggressive expansion that frequently brings it into conflict with other Necron dynasties, as well as with alien species. Imhotep is a military genius of extraordinary capability, a strategist whose campaigns are studied by Necron lords across the galaxy as examples of tactical brilliance. But he is also arrogant, territorial, and deeply suspicious of any authority that claims precedence over his own. His relationship with the Silent King is one of barely concealed tension, a dynamic in which Imhotep acknowledges Zarek's historical status, while quietly resenting the idea that anyone might have the right to dictate his actions. The Nihilak dynasty takes a different approach entirely, adopting a defensive posture built around the preservation of their existing territories at all costs. The Nihilak care nothing for expansion or conquest. They want only to protect what is theirs, and they will fight with a ferocity born of existential desperation against anyone, Necron or alien, who threatens their domain. This defensive mentality puts them at odds with dynasties like the Sautek, whose expansionist campaigns sometimes encroach upon Nihilak territory, leading to confrontations between Necron forces that should be fighting common enemies rather than each other. The Novok dynasty embraces violence with a passion that borders on the pathological. Their warriors paint their necrodermis bodies with the colors of dried blood, and their combat doctrine prioritizes close-quarters melee over the ranged warfare that most Necron forces prefer. The Novok are feared even by other Necrons for their ferocity and their willingness to engage in the kind of brutal, grinding combat that other dynasties consider wasteful and inefficient. In a species that cannot replace its losses, the Novok's appetite for attrition warfare is viewed by more calculating lords as a form of slow-motion species suicide. And then there is the Mefrit dynasty, whose obsession with solar energy and stellar weaponry has led them to develop some of the most powerful directed energy weapons in the Necron arsenal. The Mefrit's specialty lies in the manipulation of solar radiation, channeling the output of stars into focused beams of destruction that can crack continents and boil oceans. Their technological prowess makes them valuable allies but dangerous enemies, and their tendency to solve diplomatic disputes through the application of overwhelming firepower has made them unpopular with dynasties that prefer subtlety. Each of these dynasties, and dozens of others scattered across the galaxy, operates according to its own priorities, its own strategic calculus, its own understanding of what the Necron species should be doing and how it should be doing it. There is no consensus, no shared vision, but no grand strategy that unites them all toward a common purpose. The Silent King tries, with varying degrees of success, to coordinate their efforts against the threats that endanger the species as a whole. But coordinating the Necron dynasties is like herding cats that are also heavily armed and have been nursing grudges for 60 million years. Every request becomes a negotiation. Every alliance is conditional. Every cooperative venture is shadowed by the possibility that one or more participants will decide that their own interests are better served by betrayal than by cooperation. The Sarkhan dynasty, the Silent King's own, is the most powerful single faction in the Necron Empire. But even Zarek cannot force the others to follow his lead. His authority is moral and historical rather than absolute. He leads by example, by reputation and by the sheer force of his personality, a personality that has been shaped by 60 million years of guilt, exile, and determination to atone for the catastrophe of biotransference. But not every pharaoh shares his vision. Not every dynasty agrees that reversing biotransference is desirable or even possible. Not every Necron lord believes that the younger races of the galaxy should be preserved as potential vessels for the transfer of consciousness back to organic form. Some dynasties would prefer to simply exterminate all organic life and claim the galaxy as a realm of pure machines, living or otherwise. Others want to rebuild the old empire as it was, a feudal hierarchy of metal lords ruling over worlds of automated servants. And still others have descended so deeply into madness or eccentricity that their goals are incomprehensible to anyone but themselves. Trazyn the Infinite wants to collect everything interesting in the galaxy and put it in his museum. Nemesor Zahandrek wants to reunify the Necrontyr empire that ceased to exist 60 million years ago. The Destroyer cults want to annihilate everything, including themselves. And the Flayed Ones want nothing but the feel of warm flesh against their metal bodies, a desire that is as impossible to satisfy as it is disturbing to contemplate. This fractured political landscape means that the Necrons are often their own worst enemy. Resources that should be directed against the Tyranids or the forces of chaos are instead consumed by interdynasty rivalries and territorial disputes. Warriors that should be defending tomb worlds against external threats are instead deployed in campaigns of conquest against fellow Necron lords who happen to possess something that a rival pharaoh covets. The species bleeds itself through internal conflict even as external threats close in from every direction. The Silent King sees this, and it terrifies him. He has spent 60 million years in exile, contemplating the mistakes that led to biotransference, planning for the day when he would return and begin the work of saving his species from the doom he led them into. And now that he has returned, he finds that the species he is trying to save cannot even agree on whether it wants to be saved. The dynasties bicker and scheme and fight among themselves while the Tyranids consume the galaxy, while the Great Rift spews chaos into real space, while the tomb worlds crumble and the madness spreads, and the window of opportunity for reversing biotransference narrows with every passing century. It is a fear that carries a bitter echo of the Necrontyr's original downfall. The Wars of Secession nearly destroyed the Necrontyr as a species. The current fragmentation of the Necron dynasties threatens to accomplish what the civil wars of the Necrontyr could not: the complete collapse of a civilization from within. The Necrons survived the war in heaven. They survived 60 million years of the Great Sleep. They survived the loss of their souls and the shattering of their gods. But they may not survive their own inability to work together toward a common purpose. And then there are the C'tan. The relationship between the Necrons and the C'tan is one of the most complicated and tension-filled dynamics in the entire galaxy. The C'tan were the Necrons' gods, their saviors, their betrayers, and ultimately their prisoners. They are the beings who gave the Necrons their immortality, who fed upon the souls of the Necrontyr during biotransference, who led them to victory in the war in heaven, and who were ultimately betrayed in turn when the Necrons, led by the Silent King, turned their own weapons against their masters and shattered them into fragments. Most of the C'tan were broken into shards, each shard containing a fraction of the original god's power and consciousness. These shards were imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, extra-dimensional containers designed to hold them indefinitely. In theory, but the shards are completely controlled, completely contained, completely harmless. They can be deployed as weapons when the situation demands it, unleashed upon the battlefield like chained attack dogs, and then retrieved and returned to their prisons when the fighting is done. In practice, the situation is considerably more precarious than the theory suggests. The C'tan, even in their shattered state, are beings of phenomenal power. Each shard retains a fragment of the consciousness and the capabilities of the original star god, and while these fragments are far less powerful than the intact Satan would have been, they are still formidable enough to pose a serious threat if their containment were to fail. The Necrons are well aware of this danger, and they approach the deployment of Satan shards with extreme caution. Whilst the Tesseract labyrinths are only opened when the situation is truly dire, when no other weapon or strategy will suffice to meet the threat at hand. But the fear persists. The fear that one day a shard will escape, that the containment will fail, or that the shard's power will prove greater than the labyrinth's ability to hold it, that the fragments of a shattered god will somehow find each other across the vast distances that separate them and begin to reassemble, drawing together like droplets of mercury flowing across a surface, coalescing into something larger, more powerful, more dangerous than any individual shard. The deceiver, the Satan known as Mephitran, is a particular source of anxiety. Of all the star gods, the deceiver was the most cunning, the most manipulative, of the most skilled at bending others to its will through lies and misdirection. Even shattered, even imprisoned, the deceiver's shards retain this essential character. They scheme, they manipulate, they plant seeds of doubt and confusion wherever they can, working through subtle channels to advance agendas that may take centuries to unfold. The Necrons who oversee the deceiver's imprisonment know that they are guarding a prisoner who is always looking for a way out, and whose methods are so subtle that they may not even recognize an escape attempt until it is too late. What makes the deceiver's shards so insidious is that their manipulation can take forms that are almost impossible to detect. A shard of the deceiver does not need to break down the walls of its prison to cause damage. It can whisper, it can suggest. Whereas it can plant ideas in the minds of the cryptex who maintain its containment, ideas that seem perfectly reasonable and perfectly harmless, but that, when acted upon over the course of centuries, gradually weaken the barriers that keep the shard contained. A minor modification to the containment field's power frequency here. A slight adjustment to the maintenance schedule there. Each change individually insignificant. Each change completely justified by the technical reasoning presented to the maintenance crew, but cumulatively, over decades or centuries, they add up to a meaningful degradation of the containment system's effectiveness. By the time anyone notices the pattern, the damage may already be done. The Nightbringer, Azagorod, presents a different kind of fear. Where the deceiver is subtle, the Nightbringer is direct. It is the embodiment of death itself, not the gentle death of old age or the merciful death of a quick end, but the primal, screaming animal terror of annihilation that lives in the deepest recesses of every mortal mind. The Nightbringer is the reason that almost every sentient species in the galaxy fears death. Not because death is inherently terrifying, though it arguably is, but because the Nightbringer literally implanted that fear into the racial memory of every organic species it encountered during the War in Heaven. It fed on terror, and so it ensured that there would always be terror to feed on, seeding the concept of death as horror into the fundamental psychology of intelligent life. The Necrons shattered the Nightbringer along with the other Satan, but even in its fragmented state, a shard of the Nightbringer is one of the most terrifying weapons in the Necron arsenal. When deployed on the battlefield, a Nightbringer shard does not merely kill its enemies, it terrifies them first, reaching into their minds with the cold fingers of their oldest and most primal fear, and squeezing until the courage runs out and the screaming begins. Entire regiments have broken and fled at the mere sight of a Nightbringer shard manifesting on the battlefield, their training and discipline overwhelmed by a terror that is literally hardwired into their genetic code. The Void Dragon, another of the great Satan, is believed to be largely intact rather than fully shattered, and its location is a matter of considerable speculation and concern. Some accounts place a shard or aspect of the Void Dragon beneath the surface of Mars, at the seat of the Adeptus Mechanicus, where it may have been influencing human technological development for millennia. The implications of this are troubling for the Necrons. If the Void Dragon, known properly as Mag Ladroth, has been shaping the development of human technology from within, guiding the Adeptus Mechanicus along paths that serve its own inscrutable purposes, then one of the Necrons' former masters has been operating not merely beyond their control, but at the very heart of the Imperium's technological infrastructure. The machine god that the tech priests of Mars worship, the Omnissiah, whose presence they believe sanctifies their work with technology, might not be an aspect of the Emperor of Mankind at all. It might be something far older, far more alien, and far more dangerous. Something that has been patient enough to cultivate an entire human institution over the course of 10,000 years. The idea that a Catan fragment has been embedded in the most technologically advanced human institution for millennia, slowly and subtly directing the course of its development, is a thought that would disturb any Necron lord who paused long enough to consider it. The Catan are patient. They think in terms of cosmic time. A 10,000-year cultivation of a useful servant species would be nothing to a being that measured its existence against the lifespan of stars. The outsider, the Catan driven mad by consuming its own brethren during the war in heaven, fled the galaxy entirely and now resides in a Dyson sphere somewhere in the intergalactic void. The outsider was tricked by the laughing god of the Eldar, Kegorach, as into consuming other Catan, an act that shattered its sanity and left it as something uniquely terrifying, a mad god of cosmic power, alone in the darkness between galaxies, dreaming dreams that even the Tyranids have the sense to avoid. Its current state and intentions are unknown, but the fact that Tyranid hive fleets have been observed deviating from their course to avoid the outsider's location suggests that whatever the mad Catan is doing out there, it is potent enough to register on the Tyranid's threat assessment. For the Necrons, the Catan represent a unique kind of fear, the fear of the past returning. The Necrons defeated the Catan once, at tremendous cost. They shattered their former masters and imprisoned the fragments, establishing a dynamic in which the Necrons are the jailers and the Catan are the prisoners. But this dynamic is maintained through technology, not through inherent superiority. The Catan are beings of cosmic power, entities whose natural state is to consume and dominate. Keeping them contained requires constant vigilance, perpetual maintenance of the Tesseract labyrinths, and an unwavering commitment to never allowing the shards to accumulate enough power to break free. The deployment of Catan shards in battle is itself a source of fear among the Necron rank and file. When a Pharaon decides that a situation is dire enough to warrant unleashing a shard, the process of deployment is carried out with a level of caution and ceremony that speaks volumes about the danger involved. The Tesseract labyrinth is opened on the battlefield, and the shard emerges, blazing with the incandescent fury of a fragment of a star god. For the brief period that it is unshackled, the shard is a weapon of almost incalculable power, capable of feats that blur the line between technology and divine intervention. It can transmute matter at will, turning enemy soldiers to glass or their weapons to sand. It can unleash waves of cosmic energy that sear the battlefield clean of life. It can manipulate the flow of time in localized areas, aging opponents to dust in seconds or rewinding their existence to a point before they were born. But the shard is also aware. It is conscious. It knows what it is, what it was, and what it wants. And what it wants, more than anything, is to be free. Every moment a shard spends on the battlefield is a moment in which it is probing the boundaries of its containment, testing the strength of the Tesseract labyrinth's walls, looking for any weakness, any crack, any opportunity to escape and begin the long process of reassembling itself. The Necrons who deploy Catan shards know this. They know that every use carries the risk of containment failure, that the weapon they are wielding is also a prisoner constantly plotting its escape. The tactical benefits of deploying a shard must always be weighed against the catastrophic consequences of losing control of it. There have been incidents. Shards that slipped their leashes during the chaos of battle and rampaged across the battlefield, killing friend and foe alike with equal disregard. shards that managed to influence the minds of nearby Necrons, subtly adjusting their behavior to create openings for escape. Shards that, through some mechanism that even the cryptex do not fully understand, managed to communicate with other shards across vast distances, coordinating their escape attempts with a patience and cunning that reminded their jailers, uncomfortably, of the intact Citan that had once deceived an entire civilization into giving up its souls. If the Necrons falter, if their attention is divided by too many threats, if the slow decay of entropy degrades the systems that keep the Citan imprisoned, the consequences could be catastrophic. A fully reassembled Citan would be a force of nature beyond the ability of any single civilization to resist. It would be a star-eating god unshackled, and the Necrons, who know better than anyone what the Citan are capable of, have every reason to ensure that such a scenario never comes to pass. And finally, beneath all the other fears, beneath the dread of the Tyranids and the warp and the Flayer virus and the Destroyer madness and the entropy and the Satan, there lies something that deserves its own attention before we reach the deepest fear of all. It is a fear rooted not in the present, but in the ancient past, in the war in heaven itself, and it concerns the living weapons that the old ones created to fight the Necrons so many millions of years ago. The Orcs. Now, to most observers of the galaxy, the Orcs are a nuisance. A loud, violent, chaotic nuisance that occasionally rises to the level of a genuine military threat before being beaten back by superior technology and discipline. They are crude, they are disorganized, they build weapons from scrap metal and held together by what appears to be faith and sheer belligerence, whereas they fight each other as often as they fight their enemies, and their society, if you can call it that, seems to operate on the principle that the biggest, loudest, and most violent individual gets to make the decisions until someone bigger, louder, and more violent comes along to take their place. But the Necrons do not underestimate the Orcs. They cannot afford to, because the Necrons remember what the Orcs used to be. The Orcs of the 41st Millennium are a degraded, diminished version of a species called the Krork, which the Old Ones created specifically as a weapon against the Necrons during the War in Heaven. The Krork were not the shambling, scrap-wielding barbarians that the modern Orcs have become. They were massive, highly organized, technologically sophisticated warriors whose collective psychic field, or as the gestalt energy generated by their shared enthusiasm for violence, could literally reshape reality. When enough Krork gathered in one place and believed strongly enough that something was true, it became true. Their weapons worked not because of sound engineering principles, but because the Krork believed they should work. Their vehicles flew not because of any conventional understanding of physics, but because the Krork expected them to fly. The Silent King saw the Krork at their peak during the War in Heaven. He watched as these green-skinned, genetically engineered killing machines hurled themselves at Necron legions with a ferocity and resilience that taxed even the undying Silver armies. He saw them grow larger, stronger, and more dangerous the more they fought. Their biology responding to conflict the way a muscle responds to exercise, growing more powerful with every engagement. And he understood, with the cold clarity of a tactical mind that has been analyzing threats for millions of years, that the Krork were among the most dangerous weapons the Old Ones had ever created. The largest Krork specimens stood many meters tall, towering over even the massive Necron constructs that were deployed to counter them. Their technology, while crude in appearance, was powered by the collective psychic field of the entire species, meaning that its effectiveness scaled with the number of Krork in the vicinity. A lone Krork's weapon might misfire or jam. A weapon carried by a Krork in the midst of a million-strong horde would fire with devastating precision, because the combined psychic belief of all those greenskins that the weapon should work made it work. Reality be damned. This mechanic, this ability to literally alter the laws of physics through sheer collective conviction, was something that the Necrons' rational, technology-based approach to warfare had no effective counter for. You cannot build a defense against an enemy whose weapons work because they believe they should. The modern Orcs are a shadow of the Krork, diminished by millions of years, without a true challenge to drive their evolution, but they retain the fundamental characteristics that made the Krork so dangerous: their resilience, their aggression, their collective psychic field, and their ability to grow more powerful when united under a sufficiently strong leader. When an Orc warlord of sufficient charisma and power rises to unite the disparate Orc clans, the result is a greenskin horde of staggering size and ferocity, a battle-craving tidal wave that can threaten entire sectors and tie up military resources that are desperately needed elsewhere. The fear that Necron strategists harbor regarding the Orcs is not that any individual Orc, or even any individual Orc army, poses a mortal threat to the Necron species. The fear is that the Orcs represent an unlimited supply of enemies that can never be fully eradicated. Orcs reproduce through spores, microscopic biological seeds that are released into the environment whenever an Orc is present, or even when one dies. These spores are incredibly hardy, capable of surviving in virtually any environment, as from the vacuum of space to the crushing depths of ocean trenches, lying dormant for centuries before germinating into new Orcs when conditions are favorable. Once Orc spores have been introduced to a world, it is functionally impossible to remove them. The world will produce Orcs forever, generation after generation, an endless green tide that no amount of genocidal effort can permanently suppress. For a species that cannot replace its own losses, this is a terrifying prospect. Every Necron warrior destroyed in a battle against the Orcs is a permanent loss. Every Orc destroyed in the same battle will be replaced, many times over, by the spores it released during its lifetime. The math is asymmetric and unfavorable. The Necrons can win every battle and still lose the war. They're ground down over centuries by an enemy that simply never stops coming. And then there is the nightmare scenario that keeps Necron strategists awake, if awake is the right word for beings who do not sleep in the conventional sense. The scenario in which the Orcs somehow recapture the potential of their Krork ancestors, in which a warlord of sufficient power and vision rises to unite the entire Orc species, driving them to heights of fury and psychic potency that have not been seen since the War in Heaven. The Beast, the greatest Orc warlord since the War in Heaven, came terrifyingly close to achieving this during the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, building an empire that threatened to overrun the entire Imperium. If a warlord of similar or greater power were to arise again, the resulting greenskin empire could pose a threat that even the fully awakened Necrons would struggle to contain. The Necrons survived the Krork once, but only barely, and only with the aid of the Satan's cosmic power. They no longer have that power at their disposal, and the universe has not become any more forgiving in the intervening 60 million years. And then there are the Eldar, those graceful, ancient enemies whose rivalry with the Necrons stretches back to the War in Heaven itself. The Eldar were created by the Old Ones as the premier psychic weapon against the Necrons, engineered with an unparalleled connection to the warp that made them devastatingly effective against soulless opponents. The modern Eldar are a fractured and diminished people, their great empire long since collapsed in the catastrophe of the Fall, their numbers dwindling with every passing generation, but they remain among the most individually powerful warriors and psykers in the galaxy, and their Farseers possess the ability to peer into the future, identifying threats and opportunities with a prescience that gives them a strategic advantage far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The Eldar know the Necrons. They remember the War in Heaven with a clarity that transcends mere historical record. Their mythologies are filled with stories of the ancient enemy, the Silver Legions that swept across the galaxy like a metallic tide, consuming worlds and extinguishing stars. When the Necrons began to awaken, the Eldar were among the first to recognize the threat, and they have been working actively to contain and destroy awakening tomb worlds wherever they find them. For the Necrons, the Eldar represent a particularly frustrating kind of threat. They are psychically powerful, which means they can exploit the Necrons' primary vulnerability. They are mobile, using the webway to strike anywhere in the galaxy and vanish before a counterattack can be organized. And they are prescient, using their Farseer's ability to see the future, to anticipate Necron strategies, and position their forces accordingly. Fighting the Eldar is like fighting a ghost that can see the future and hit you with lightning from another dimension. The Necrons have the technological advantage, but the Eldar have the informational one, and in a galaxy where intelligence is often more valuable than firepower, that advantage counts for a great deal. And the Craftworld Eldar have been known to launch preemptive strikes against tomb worlds that show signs of awakening, destroying them before the Necrons within can fully rouse from their stasis. The methods are varied and effective. Precision warp blasts that destabilize the stasis systems, psychic assaults that scramble the engrammatic pathways of Necrons still in the process of reactivating, or simply the application of overwhelming military force against a tomb world whose defenders are not yet coordinated enough to mount an effective defense. For the Necrons, these attacks are particularly galling because they represent the one scenario that all their defensive preparations cannot adequately address. A tomb world's defenses are designed to activate in sequence as the occupants awaken, and building from passive monitoring through automated canoptech responses to full military mobilization. An Elder strike that hits during the early stages of this sequence, before the overlords and cryptechs have fully awakened to coordinate the defense, can overwhelm a tomb world that would otherwise be nearly impregnable. And then there is humanity, the Imperium of man. The Necrons do not fear humanity the way they fear the Tyranids or the Warp. Humanity, in the grand calculus of Necron threat assessment, is not an existential danger. Individual humans are fragile, short-lived, technologically primitive by Necron standards, and prone to the kind of self-destructive political and religious fanaticism that limits their strategic effectiveness. The Imperium of man is vast, yes, sprawling across 1,000,000 worlds, but it is also slow, or bureaucratic, riddled with corruption and internal conflict, and fighting a war on every conceivable front simultaneously. In a direct military confrontation between a fully awakened Necron dynasty and an equivalent Imperial force, the Necrons would prevail more often than not. But the Necrons are not stupid, and the wiser among them recognize that humanity possesses qualities that make them dangerous in ways that raw military power alone cannot address. First, there is the sheer weight of human numbers. The Imperium fields armies that number in the hundreds of billions, drawing from a population so vast that even the most devastating casualties represent a statistically insignificant fraction of the whole. For a species that cannot replace its losses, fighting an enemy that can throw billions of bodies at a problem and consider it a reasonable use of resources is deeply unsettling. The Necrons might win every engagement and still find themselves gradually worn down by the endless tide of humanity, each battle costing them warriors they can never replace, while the Imperium simply recruits another 100 million from the overcrowded hive worlds and keeps fighting. Second, there is the growing psychic potential of the human species. Humanity is evolving, slowly but unmistakably, toward a greater connection to the Warp. The proportion of psykers in the human population is increasing with every generation, and while most of these psykers are weak, unstable, and as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy, the overall trend is troubling for the Necrons. And a species that is becoming more psychically powerful with every passing century is a species that is becoming more dangerous to soulless beings who have no defense against psychic attack. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there is the Emperor of mankind. Even entombed upon the golden throne, his physical form a desiccated husk, sustained by technology that his own subjects barely understand, the Emperor remains one of the most powerful psychic entities in the galaxy. His presence in the Warp is a beacon of staggering intensity, a blazing light that guides human navigators through the immaterium and holds back the darkness that would otherwise consume the Imperium from within. The Necrons have limited understanding of the Emperor's true nature and capabilities, but what they do know is enough to warrant caution. A being of such enormous psychic power, who has already demonstrated the ability to create transhuman warriors, like the Space Marines, and whose influence extends across the entire galaxy through the Astronomicon, is not something to be dismissed as merely another organic leader on a merely another organic world. Some Necron scholars have drawn uncomfortable parallels between the Emperor and the Citan. Both are beings of transcendent power who shape the destiny of their respective species. Both demand worship, whether they intended to or not. Both have been described as gods by those who serve them. And both, crucially, may be playing games on a scale that even the most brilliant mortal minds cannot fully comprehend. The possibility that the Emperor is somehow more than he appears, that his entombment on the Golden Throne is not merely a tragic necessity, but part of some larger plan that extends across millennia, is a thought that gives even the most confident Necron overlord reason to pause. The Necrons do not fear humanity today, but some of them fear what humanity might become tomorrow. A fully unified Imperium under a restored Emperor, with a population of trillions and a growing proportion of powerful psychers, directed by a mind that has been planning and scheming for over 10,000 years, from a throne of gold at the heart of the most powerful human civilization in history. That is a prospect that even the Necrons would have to take seriously. But beneath all these external fears, beneath the dread of the Tyranids, and the Warp, and the Orcs, and the Eldar, and the Imperium, and the Entropy, and the Citan, there lies the deepest fear of all. The fear that is so fundamental, so pervasive, so woven into the very fabric of Necron consciousness, that most of them cannot even articulate it. The fear of themselves. The fear of what they are. The fear of what they have become. The fear that the beings walking through the corridors of the tomb worlds, the beings commanding the legions and plotting the strategies and collecting the artifacts and pursuing the obsessions, are not really the Necrontyr at all. That the real Necrontyr died 60 million years ago in the biofurnaces of the Citan, and what remains are copies, echoes, sophisticated imitations running on engrammatic circuitry that mimics consciousness without truly possessing it. This question, the question of whether a consciousness transferred from organic tissue to mechanical substrate remains the same consciousness or becomes something fundamentally different, is not merely academic for the Necrons. It is the central uncertainty of their entire existence. If they are the same beings who walked into the biofurnaces, then their suffering has meaning. Their memories are genuine, and their hope of restoration is not merely a fantasy, but a legitimate aspiration that could, in theory, be fulfilled. But if they are not, if the beings who emerged from biotransference are merely very convincing copies of the people who went in, equipped with borrowed memories and simulated emotions that mimic the original without truly replicating it, then everything they have endured has been suffered by beings who never actually existed in the first place. The original Necrontyr are dead. The things that carry their names are something else entirely. And the dream of restoration is not a dream at all, but a malfunction. A programming error that generates a desire for a state of being that the current occupant of the body never actually experienced. This uncertainty gnaws at the foundations of every Necron's identity. It is the question that cannot be asked, and cannot be answered, and cannot be ignored. It sits in the back of every conversation, every battle, every moment of reflection, like a stone in a shoe that cannot be removed. This is the dysphorak, the existential crisis that strikes when a Necron suddenly, viscerally, remembers that it does not have lungs, cannot breathe. It cannot feel the warmth of sunlight on skin it no longer possesses. It is a moment of absolute horror, a flash of awareness in which the full weight of biotransference crashes down upon a consciousness that has been carefully avoiding confronting it. Some Necrons experience the dysphorak only rarely, in moments of quiet between battles, when the absence of sensation becomes impossible to ignore. Others are tormented by it constantly, driven to the brink of madness by the perpetual awareness that they are not what they once were, that the life they remember living belongs to someone who no longer exists. Imagine, if you can, what a moment of dysphorak feels like from the inside. You are standing in a corridor of a tomb world, a corridor that you built 60 million years ago in a body you no longer possess. The light is green and cold and comes from sources that hum with the quiet efficiency of technology, so old it predates the concept of age. You are alone. The last battle is over. The next has not yet begun. And in the silence between, your thoughts turn inward. You remember sunlight. Not the data readout from an optical sensor indicating electromagnetic radiation in the visible spectrum, but the actual feeling of warmth on skin. The way it made you squint and shield your eyes. The way it felt different in the morning than in the afternoon. Softer and more gentle before the full heat of the day set in. You remember this with absolute clarity, the memory preserved in the organic remnants of your brain with a fidelity that mocks your current existence. You can recall exactly what sunlight felt like. You simply cannot feel it anymore. You try to breathe, an impulse left over from 60 million years of biological programming, and hear nothing. No rush of air, no expansion of lungs, no rhythmic pulse of a heart that has not beaten since before the planet Earth formed. You are a consciousness suspended in machinery, a thought without a thinker, a memory without a mind to hold it. That is the dysphorak. That moment of vertigo, of existential freefall, when the gap between what you remember being and what you actually are becomes suddenly, unbearably vivid. It lasts only a moment, usually. The Necron mind is resilient in its own mechanical way, and the consciousness quickly reasserts its defensive routines, pushing the awareness back down, filing it away, sealing it behind barriers of distraction and purpose, but the damage is done. Another hairline crack in a foundation that cannot be repaired. The Twice Dead King novels explore this condition with devastating empathy through the character of Altix, a Necron prince who grapples with the Flare virus even as he struggles to hold his crumbling dynasty together. Altix's inner life, such as it is a constant battle between the remnants of his Necrontier identity and the cold, mechanical reality of his Necron existence. He remembers being alive. He remembers what it felt like to have a body of flesh and blood, to experience the world through organic senses, to feel emotions with the full richness and depth that only a soul can provide. And he knows, with a certainty that no amount of denial can soften, that those experiences are gone forever, that the being who had those experiences is dead, and the thing that carries his name and his memories is something fundamentally different, something less, something hollow. What makes Altix's story so affecting is not just the horror of his situation, but the way he responds to it. He does not surrender to despair, though despair is readily available. He does not succumb to the Flare virus, though its tendrils are constantly reaching for him. He fights, not with the cold efficiency of a machine executing its programming, but with the desperate, messy, emotionally complicated determination of a person who refuses to stop being a person, even though every aspect of his existence is telling him that personhood is no longer available to him. He clings to the remnants of his identity the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, not because it can save him, but because letting go would mean admitting that he is already lost. Trazyn the Infinite offers another window into how Necrons cope with the dysphorak, though his method is perhaps the most eccentric in the entire species. Trazyn has channeled his existential crisis into an obsession with collecting and preserving. His galleries on Solemnace contain specimens of almost every significant species, culture, and event in galactic history, frozen in stasis fields and catalogued with a meticulousness that borders on the pathological. On one level, Trazyn's collection is merely the hobby of a powerful being with too much time and too few genuine interests. But on a deeper level, it is a response to the fundamental horror of his condition. Trazyn preserves things because he himself cannot be preserved, not as he was, not as the Necrontire he remembers being. His collection is a monument to the permanence he has lost, a vast, obsessive attempt to hold on to something, anything, in a universe where everything he cares about is slipping through fingers that can no longer feel what they are holding. The Necron, known as Orican the Diviner, takes yet another approach. Orican has devoted his existence to the study of time itself, using chronomantic technology to peer into the past and the future with equal facility. His stated goal is nothing less than the transcendence of his current form, the achievement of a state of being that is neither Necrontire nor Necron, but something entirely new, something that combines the consciousness of the former with the immortality of the latter, while discarding the limitations of both. Or whether this goal is achievable or merely the grandest delusion in a species full of them remains to be seen. But Orican's very pursuit of it is a response to the dysphorac, an attempt to find a third option in a situation that seems to offer only two. Accept what you have become, or go mad trying to return to what you were. This is the fear that underlies all the other fears. The fear that the Necrons are not survivors of a tragedy, but victims of it. That they did not escape death through biotransference, but merely postponed it, trading a quick end for an infinitely prolonged diminishment that will eventually claim everything they were, everything they are, and everything they could ever hope to become. It is the fear that immortality, the one thing they sacrificed everything to obtain, is not a gift but a curse. Not a triumph over death, but a particularly cruel form of it. A death that takes everything, soul, emotion, identity, sanity, and leaves behind only a walking, talking, fighting shell that remembers what it used to be and cannot stop mourning the loss. There is a phrase that recurs throughout Necron lore, a phrase that captures the essence of this existential dread with the economy and precision that only a species of engineers could achieve. Through technology, we thought to defeat the natural order, but the onset of eternity cannot be denied forever. The universe will see us humbled for our presumption, yet its methods of attack are limited. We long ago removed our bodies from mortality's grasp and bartered away our souls for technological baubles and the trappings of power. Our minds, then, are all that remains for us to lose, and it is here that the next stroke against us will fall. The next stroke, the final attack, the one thing that the Necrons cannot defend against, cannot repair, cannot regenerate from. The slow, patient, inexorable erosion of their minds, their personalities, their identities, the last remnants of what made them who they were. It is not an attack launched by an enemy army or a rival civilization. It is the attack of time itself, the one force that even immortal machines cannot resist, the one weapon against which living metal and Gauss technology and Blackstone pylons are all equally useless. This is what the Necrons are afraid of. Not any single threat, not any individual enemy, not any particular scenario or battle or conflict. They are afraid of the totality of their situation, the interlocking web of internal and external threats that closes around them like the walls of a trap designed by a universe that does not forgive the presumption of those who try to cheat death. They are afraid of losing their minds to the Flayer virus and the Destroyer madness. They are afraid of the warp and the chaos gods, whose influence they cannot counter directly. They are afraid of the Tyranids, who threaten to devour the very organic life they need to save themselves. They are afraid of the entropy that slowly degrades their tomb worlds and their sanity with every passing century. They are afraid of the Satan, whose shattered remnants still scheme behind the walls of their prisons. And above all, they are afraid of themselves, of what they have become, of what they are becoming, yet of the slow fade into meaninglessness that awaits every consciousness that exists long enough in a body that was never meant to house it. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Necrons stand as proof that there are things worse than death. They sought immortality and found it, only to discover that immortality without a soul is not life, but a prison sentence of infinite duration. They fought the greatest wars in galactic history and won them all, only to realize that victory means nothing when you have lost the capacity to appreciate it. They built the most advanced technology the galaxy has ever seen, only to find that no amount of engineering can rebuild a soul or repair a broken mind. And so they march on. Is silver legions advancing through the stars with the cold precision of beings who have nothing left to lose, except the last flickering remnants of who they used to be. They fight not for glory or conquest, or any of the passionate human motivations that drive the other great powers of the galaxy. They fight because fighting is the only alternative to stillness, and stillness is where the fears live, in the quiet moments between the thunder of Gauss weapons and the crash of living metal on alien stone. There is something deeply human about the Necrons' predicament, even though they themselves would reject the comparison. The fear of losing yourself, of looking in the mirror one day and not recognizing what looks back, is not unique to beings who have undergone biotransference. It is a fear that resonates across species and across ages, a fear that touches anything with a mind complex enough to contemplate its own existence. We all, in our own small ways, struggle against the forces that would reduce us to something less than what we aspire to be. We all fight against the entropy that threatens our identities, the slow erosion of memory and purpose and meaning that comes with the passage of time. The Necrons simply experience this struggle on a scale that is cosmic in its scope and geological in its duration. Their fears are our fears, magnified to the point of absurdity and stretched across the lifespan of the galaxy. The fear of death that drove the Necrontire to make their terrible bargain is the same fear that every mortal being has felt in the small hours of the night when sleep will not come and the darkness presses close. The fear of losing oneself that haunts every self-aware Necron is the same fear that accompanies every major transformation in a human life. The fear that the person who emerges from the change will not be the person who entered it, that growth and transformation come at the cost of the self that existed before. What makes the Necrons' version of this fear so compelling is its permanence. Humans fear these things, but they also have the comfort of knowing that their fears are bounded by their lifespans. A human life, even a long one, will eventually end, and with it, the fears and sorrows and regrets that accompanied it. The Necrons have no such comfort. Their fears will last as long as they do, which is to say, forever. There is no retirement from the existential crisis of being a Necron. There is no therapy, no medication, no spiritual practice that can resolve the fundamental contradiction of a consciousness that remembers what it was like to be alive, but can never experience it again. There is only the endless march forward, one mechanical step at a time, through a universe that grows more hostile and more alien with every passing century. In the silence of the tomb worlds, in the darkness between the stars, the fears wait. The Flayer virus spreads. The Destroyer madness claims new victims. The tomb worlds decay. The Tyranids advance. The Cetan scheme, the warp pulses, and the minds of the Necrons, those last, fragile, irreplaceable fragments of the Necrontyr, who once lived and breathed and dreamed beneath a murderous star, continue their long, slow fade into the void. Some might say the Necrons have nothing to fear because they have already lost everything worth losing, but that is not quite true. They still have their memories, fading though they may be. They still have their identities, eroding though they are. They still have the dream of restoration, of one day reclaiming the organic existence that was stolen from them, of walking again beneath a kinder star in bodies that can feel and souls that can soar. As long as that dream persists, the Necrons have something to lose. And as long as they have something to lose, they have something to fear. The universe, it seems, saves its cruelest ironies for those who dare to cheat the natural order. The Necrons sought immortality and received it. They just did not realize that immortality, in the absence of a soul, is not a triumph over death. It is merely a different kind of dying, one that never ends. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all. So, there you have it. The deepest fears of the galaxy's most ancient and powerful civilization, laid bare for your contemplation. From the primal terror of mortality that drove the Necrontier to sell their souls for eternal life, to the existential horror of discovering that the cure was worse than the disease. From the contagious madness of the Flare virus to the nihilistic despair of the Destroyer cult. From the vulnerability to a warp they cannot navigate or defend against, to the overwhelming threat of a tyrannid swarm that threatens to devour the very possibility of redemption. From the slow entropy that crumbles their tomb worlds and their sanity, to the chained gods who wait patiently for the chance to break free. Or from the living weapons of the old ones that can never be fully eradicated, to the fractured dynasties that cannot agree on how to save themselves. And beneath it all, the fundamental, inescapable fear of being trapped in an existence that is neither life nor death, but something in between, something that remembers what it was like to be alive and can never, ever go back. What I find most compelling about the Necrons' fears is the way they mirror, in their exaggerated and cosmic form, fears that we all carry within us. The fear of losing ourselves, the fear of being trapped in a situation we cannot escape, the fear of watching the things we care about slip away while we are powerless to hold on to them, the fear that the choices we made to survive might have cost us something that survival cannot replace. These are not alien fears, but they are deeply, profoundly human, which is part of what makes the Necrons such a fascinating and tragic faction in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They are a mirror held up to our own anxieties, distorted by the lens of science fiction and the grim aesthetic of the far future, but recognizable nonetheless. The Necrons teach us that power is not the same as security, that immortality is not the same as living, that the things we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of survival might be the very things that make survival worth pursuing in the first place. Their story is a cautionary tale written in living metal and powered by the guttering remnants of 60 million stolen souls, and it has been resonating through the corridors of the galaxy since before the first human ancestor crawled out of the primordial ocean and looked up at the stars with wonder. If you found this journey through the fears of the Necrons as fascinating as I found it in the telling, I would be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like and every subscription helps this channel grow, and it lets me know that these deep explorations into the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40k universe are something you want to see more of. If you have thoughts on what the Necrons fear most, or if there are other aspects of their lore that you think deserve a closer look, drop a comment below. I read every single one of them, and your insights often lead me to topics and angles that I would never have considered on my own. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, in a universe where even immortal machines are afraid, there is no shame in acknowledging the things that frighten us. The courage is not in being fearless. The courage is in going on despite the fear. Sleep well, and try not to think about what might be waiting beneath the surface of the world you are standing on, because 60 million years is a very long time to sleep, and the Necrons are waking up. Good night.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.